Chapter 1476. Although Luo Fan's prediction ability was extremely powerful, it also depended on the target he was predicting. If it was an ordinary cultivator, he would naturally be able to predict whatever he wanted. However, if the existence he was predicting was an extremely powerful Supreme Venerable, the situation would obviously be different. The cultivators who left their marks in this void were almost all Supreme Venerables. If Luo Fan wanted to predict their situation, it would be impossible unless he could spend endless energy and a lot of time. Luo Fan obviously did not want to waste so much time on this little curiosity. Therefore, Luo Fan made a prompt decision to leave at this time. The direction in which Luo Fan left was the direction where the inexplicable summoning came from. In this void, everything was idealistic. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan found that he had arrived in a strange world. This strange world was fundamentally part of the boundless thousand world. However, its level had already been raised to a level that could not be compared to ordinary colossal worlds. It was simply another demon world, another central main world. Just outside this world, Luo Fan could vaguely feel an aura that belonged to a sage coming from this world. Obviously, this world was also a great world with sages, or rather, fake sages. Sages are everywhere, and fake sages are like dogs. Luo Fan suddenly thought of this sentence, and he could not help but smile bitterly. Back then, when Earth was still the main body of the universe, he was already a fake sage. This was already enough to shock him and make him feel almost unbearable pressure. However, he now realized that not to mention fake sages, even Supreme Venerables had become so common. The originally high and mighty and illusory sages appeared one after another in front of him, as if they were going to a market. That inexplicable summoning was coming from somewhere in this world. His heart skipped a beat. Luo Fan stepped into that world. In an instant, countless strands of perception swept over his body. More than 10 of them were not only so powerful that he was unable to resist them, but they also instantly swept through his entire body, making it seem so illusory. If not for the fact that Luo Fan controlled 73 saints in his own world, he would not have been able to resist them. This made him extremely familiar with the saint. Perhaps they would even overlook these dozen or so senses. As for the rest, however, the moment it came into contact with him, it was blasted back by his instinctive defense. It was impossible to truly touch him, let alone see through everything about him. It was this instant of change. Luo Fan knew that there were at least 18 sages in this world. The dozen or so senses that had scanned him inside and out did not come from other existences, but from the saints. Only the saints of this world could be so relaxed. Shattering his defenses, directly grasping all of his secrets inside and out. Noticing this, Luo Fan frowned slightly. He raised his head and looked at a place in this world that he still could not control. It was also a strange state that was similar to the state of chaos, and he felt extremely unhappy. No one would feel happy when all their secrets had been thoroughly probed by someone else. Even if Luo Fan was only an incarnation here, and the secrets contained in it were only what he could show others, it did not involve the mysteries of his real galaxy. It was the same. However, at this time, although Luo Fan could unleash all of his strength in this world and did not need to analyze the laws of heaven and earth with great difficulty like other Supreme Venerables or level 9 pseudo-sages to be able to unleash all of his strength, he did not have the supreme authority after all. He was definitely not a match for any pseudo-sages in this world. Therefore, even if he was unhappy, he could only forcefully swallow this unhappiness and retract his gaze. As if he did not feel anything, he stepped toward the place where the summoning was coming from. This world was a world where the sky was round and the earth was square. The entire world, the land below was flat, and the sky was boundless. Endless stars were arranged in the depths of the void, flickering with an inexplicable brilliance and spreading endless star essence everywhere in this world. Compared to the world that Luo Fan had experienced in the past, the land below seemed extremely different. The gravity of the entire land was not fixed at all. Not only was the size not fixed, but even the direction was also different. This strange phenomenon caused the climate on this land to be different everywhere. Almost every few kilometers, there would be a completely different climate and environment. This place was so dry that the water in any living creature's body would evaporate in just a few minutes. A few kilometers away, there might be continuous rainstorms, causing even the most water-loving animals and plants to be unable to survive in this area. Here, the gravity might be so strong that it could crush steel into pieces. A few kilometers away, there might be no gravity, allowing people to float freely. Or perhaps the gravity would be reversed and make people fall from the sky. Living creatures that grew up in such an environment were naturally all kinds of strange things. It could be said that almost any living creature that was extremely ordinary in other worlds, after being eliminated by the environment here, would have all kinds of power that the same kind in other worlds could not compare to. They would become cultivation treasures that the cultivators of other worlds wanted to obtain. The cultivators that grew up in this world were naturally different from those of other worlds. They were born with a huge advantage in the use of the power of nature. Even when they were extremely weak, they could easily cultivate all kinds of abilities that could almost be regarded as magical powers in other worlds. Even if it was originally a very ordinary martial art, its limit was far higher than other heavens and earths by several levels. If one looked at the martial arts of this world purely, it could be said that this world could be regarded as a legendary world of high martial arts. Although Luo Fan was worried about the person who had summoned him, after seeing the various wonders of this world, he could not help but be curious. He couldn't help but feel curious, so he slowed down his pace and walked forward at a leisurely pace. Occasionally, when he saw something interesting, he even stopped to study it. It was not until he obtained it or understood the reason behind it that he set off again. Just like this, he walked for over a year before he slowly arrived at the location where the summoning had come from. This was actually a manifestation of his dissatisfaction with the characteristics of the summoning. That kind of summoning. It was really too overbearing. It was so strong. It was even close to being absorbed. If it was not for his amazing strength that allowed him to stabilize his body, he might have completely lost the ability to control his body. He was directly summoned. Facing such a summoning, because of the curiosity in his heart, Luo Fan naturally responded to the summoning. But, because the summoning was too overbearing, However, he wasn't willing to follow the wishes of the person who had summoned him so easily. Thus, he had traveled at a leisurely pace. In the end, a journey that should have only taken a few breaths of time had been dragged to more than a year's time. This was a mountain range. A mountain range with an extremely chaotic environment. In other places between heaven and earth, the change of climate was measured in units of miles. But in this place, it was measured in units of zhang. That was to say, in other areas of this world, the change of climate within a few miles would be abrupt and drastic. But in this place, there was a change of climate almost every 10 feet. In this area, there was a downpour. In the next 10 feet, the climate was as dry as a desert. In this 10 feet, the storm was so strong that it scraped off a thick layer of the ground. In the next 10 feet, the air was calm and there was not even a trace of wind. A mountain formed in such an environment naturally showed a completely different form from any mountain range that Luo Fan had seen before. The shape of the entire mountain was so strange that it was almost indescribable with words. Even calling it a mountain range didn't seem appropriate. The entire mountain range did not have the structure of a normal mountain range. It looked like an extremely abstract work of art. The shape of the mountain did not follow the rule of big at the bottom and small at the top. There was no concept of flatness, and there was no principle that a mountain must be continuous. It looked like a child casually sketching an extremely complicated and chaotic picture on a piece of paper, and then directly turning it into a mountain range. Looking at such a mountain range, even Luo Fan, who had almost seen all kinds of terrains that could appear in this world in the past year, could not help but feel that it was an eye-opener. So many chaotic environments actually form this kind of shape. It's really amazing, Luo Fan exclaimed in admiration as he slowly stepped into the mountain range. Although the changes of the environment in this mountain range were extremely complicated and dangerous, that was only for ordinary creatures and cultivators. However, that was only for ordinary creatures and cultivators. For an existence like Luo Fan, who had almost surpassed the pseudo-sage stage, it was really no threat at all. Even if he stood there quietly and endured the pressure of the environmental changes, he would not be hurt or feel any pressure. The place where the summoning came from was somewhere in the middle of this mountain range. Since he was already here, Luo Fan did not want to waste any more time. After spending half a day, he arrived at the center and arrived in front of the existence that summoned him. I didn't expect the sage to transform into this. This is really beyond my expectations. After seeing the existence clearly, Luo Fan understood everything and sighed. The one who had summoned him in such an overbearing manner was not a human, nor was it an animal, nor was it a cultivator. It was a mountain. It was an extremely short mountain that was only about 300 meters tall. It was straight from top to bottom, and it seemed to have a vague human silhouette. This small mountain looked extremely ordinary, but Luo Fan could tell at a glance that there was a faintly discernible willpower attached to this mountain. Although this willpower was clear, it was completely dragged down by this mountain. It had to bear the invasion of all the strange climate in the entire mountain range, and it could not leave this mountain at all. This willpower was extremely familiar to Luo Fan because it came from the sage that was born in the world in his heart. However, he felt that this willpower was unfamiliar because it was no longer the willpower of the sage from before. It had become an extremely ordinary willpower. It was a willpower that had the characteristics of a mountain rock. This was naturally extremely unfamiliar to Luo Fan. When Luo Fan said this, the willpower shook slightly. This vibration did not make any sound, but it could transmit information. As soon as Luo Fan saw it, he knew the message contained in the vibration. The will was saying, "I didn't expect fellow Taoists to come so soon. I thought it would take a few thousand years or tens of thousands of years before you would come." After knowing what it meant, Luo Fan smiled. He said, "Originally I had this thought. However, I gave up on it. It's fortunate that I arrived so early. Otherwise, I'm afraid I would have missed the sage." At this moment, he could clearly feel that this willpower had already been assimilated by this small mountain. The clear spiritual consciousness within it. However, it was gradually becoming blurry. At this rate, in just a few thousand years, this willpower would completely lose its spiritual consciousness. This will was about to completely lose its intelligence and truly become a mountain with intelligence that was completely different from that of a normal living being. When that happened, even if Luo Fan came here, he would only see the willpower of this mountain. It would no longer be the sage's willpower. It was precisely because he had seen through this that he had said that he would arrive in thousands or tens of thousands of years. He was afraid that he would miss this sage. "I'm no longer a sage. You can call me Boulder," the willpower said through vibration. Luo Fan did not insist on this. After all, it was just a matter of addressing him. "Let's not talk about this for now. I can see that you're not in a good condition. Let's wait for you to transform before we talk about other things," said Luo Fan with a smile. As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed at the small mountain. In an instant, the layer of laws in the void rippled strangely. Boundless mysterious power was born and frantically poured into the small mountain. The will within the small mountain started to grow crazily after receiving this mysterious energy. It broke through one limit after another. Not long after, it broke free from the predicament of being assimilated by the small mountain. A human figure started to gradually appear. As the willpower of a former sage, even if this was not the sage's world, even if its willpower had only recovered a little and only broken free from the predicament of being shackled, it had already completely revealed its uniqueness. In an instant, it no longer relied on Luo Fan to absorb the power of the layer of laws. Instead, it directly communicated with the layer of laws. Then, it borrowed the power of the layer of laws to continuously evolve. Finally, with its weak willpower that had just broken free from the shackles of the small mountain, it communicated with the Grand Tao. In the past, this kind of ability could only be achieved by an extremely powerful cultivator. Normally speaking, the willpower would need to be at least tens of millions of times stronger to have a chance of communicating with the Grand Tao. But at this moment, the willpower was extremely clear. It didn't show any signs of difficulty, but it had already achieved this. In fact, his expression was extremely calm at this moment. It was as if all he had done was raise his palm or blink his eyes, something that was extremely easy for him. Seeing that the willpower could communicate with the Grand Tao on its own, Luo Fan smiled and stopped the method of changing the layer of laws to pour power into the small mountain. He just stood quietly to the side, waiting for the willpower to change. The willpower didn't feel displeased at Luo Fan's letting go. It nodded at Luo Fan and called out softly. Endless mysteries of the Grand Tao surged into it. During this process, its willpower began to improve at a speed countless times faster than before. In the short span of a few breaths, it increased by tens of thousands of times. It brazenly broke through the barrier between the mortal realm and the immortal realm and directly raised its willpower to the itinerant immortal realm. Then, in just 2 hours, it made successive breakthroughs and directly raised its willpower to the quasi-saint realm. At this point, the improvement finally slowed down. Realizing this, the willpower raised its hand and pointed at the small mountain. In an instant, endless power surged out of the Grand Tao and poured into the small mountain. The small mountain began to undergo all sorts of subtle changes. The entire mountain began to gradually compress and soften. From its original appearance of a mountain rock, it gradually transformed into the appearance of flesh and blood. Finally, amidst an earth-shattering tremor, the small mountain turned into the appearance of a handsome man who was 8 feet tall. After the small mountain turned into a man, the willpower retreated. It retreated into the man's body and instantly fused with him. As they fused, a mysterious change appeared on the surface of the sword. The combination of the mysteries of the Grand Tao and the power produced an indescribable change. In an instant, the body's cultivation began to rise at an unimaginable speed. One realm after another was broken through. In just a short month, a level 9 pseudo-sage directly appeared in front of Luo Fan. He bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Thank you for your help, fellow Taoist." Seeing this, Luo Fan smiled. He said, "It's just a slight effort." On the other hand, fellow Taoist went from a mortal to a level 9 pseudo-sage in a month. This kind of godly might has broadened my horizons. Moreover, I haven't thanked fellow Taoist Boulder for saving my life back then. Although becoming a pseudo-sage has great hidden dangers, it can't be truly carefree. However, there are still some benefits. This was the sage of the past. The current Taoist Boulder said. As he said this, he sensed the surroundings slightly and frowned. This world is extremely powerful. Although I've used some pseudo-sage abilities to hide the movements here for a month, it's impossible for me to hide it from them for a long time. Many people must have sensed the movements here and come to investigate. Let's leave this place first. At the same time, Luo Fan naturally sensed that some powerful existences were traversing through space. He was not surprised by the Taoist Boulder's words. He nodded and said, "I discovered a hidden place in this world previously. It's suitable to open up a cave abode. Let's go there." The Taoist Boulder was naturally indifferent. He immediately tore open space with Luo Fan and traversed through space towards the location that he had his eyes on previously. As the two of them left, the mountain range suddenly began to shake violently. The originally extremely stable mountain began to gradually collapse and fall. The countless living beings on the mountain seemed to be at the end of the world at this moment. They howled miserably and ran around in all directions. Although the mountain that the Taoist boulder had originally attached himself to was small, it was the core of this mountain range. The source of the extremely strange and unique environment that originally existed in this mountain range was the existence of this small mountain. Since that was the case, when the mountain turned into the Taoist boulder and left the mountain range, the strange environment of the mountain range gradually returned to the world's normal environment. The mountain's original form was formed due to the influence of this extremely unique environment over countless years. It had long become one with the environment. When the environment remained the same, it was indeed extremely stable. However, once the environment changed, it naturally could not maintain its form and directly collapsed. At this moment, a few figures traversed through space and appeared in the void. When they saw each other, they were all on guard and maintained a certain distance from each other. Some greeted each other, while others pretended not to see each other. Every single one of them had an aura that was eternal and indestructible. Evidently, they were all supreme supremacies. The few of them hovered in the void and scanned the mountain range. They instantly knew what was going on. I didn't expect someone to come and enlighten that boulder. Who's so bored as to do that? One of the women said with a frown. What a pity. If I'd known that the boulder would have such great aptitude after being enlightened, I would have acted earlier. What a pity, what a pity. Another man who had greeted the woman sighed. Is it really as simple as enlightening it? Another person frowned and pondered. Putting on an act. Who can't tell that there's a problem here? Who's seen an ordinary boulder become a level 9 false saint in a short month after being enlightened? Another person clearly did not like them and said coldly. The person who spoke earlier only smiled faintly. He did not even bother to reply to this person's cold words. After greeting each other, they turned around and disappeared without a trace. In the end, only the last person who spoke was left. This person did not care about the others leaving without giving him any face. His expression did not change at all. He merely frowned and sensed the various details in his surroundings, studying the many traces left behind in this mountain range. Chapter 1477. Luo Fan and the Taoist boulder went straight to the place that Luo Fan had taken a fancy to. This was a place where the gravitational force surpassed the limits, and could almost crush the hardest matter in the world into powder. Even light could not escape. If this was the Earth universe after the world was destroyed, such an existence would be called a black hole. However, in this world where there were saints, such an existence was only a slightly more dangerous place. It might be extremely dangerous to ordinary cultivators, and they would not dare to approach it. However, to Luo Fan and the Taoist boulder, the powerful gravitational force here did not bring them any negative feelings. The natural environment here could isolate all sorts of prying eyes and disturbances. It was a good place to establish a cave abode. However, this was only a very ordinary place to Luo Fan and the Taoist boulder. Naturally, they would not pay too much attention to it. After arriving here, Luo Fan casually patted the void with his hand. Instantly, a world was created out of thin air. The shape of the world was what Luo Fan liked. It was the shape of a starry sky in the universe. After arriving here, Luo Fan asked, "How did you come to this world? Didn't you perish together with the saint back then?" The Taoist boulder smiled. "I was a saint back then. How could I perish so easily? Although it seemed like I perished together with the saint, my essence was not destroyed. Instead, I was thrown into the cycle of reincarnation and was controlled by it. I was reborn randomly between the heavens and the earth, and finally arrived in this world. Billions of years ago, I turned into a boulder. After living in a muddle-headed state for so many years, I only regained my consciousness recently. I see. Seems like it's a pity. If the world had not been destroyed at the same time, you might still be a saint. Luo Fan sighed. He did not find it strange that the Taoist boulder had turned into a boulder billions of years ago, even though he had only died a few years ago as a saint. Whether it was him or the Taoist boulder, this change in time and space was obvious. These were all obvious truths, but they weren't worthy of their attention at all. Although you will still be a saint, you will not be able to transcend your soul, no matter how high your nature is. In comparison, although I'm not a saint, I'm already in reality. It's not easy to judge the gains and losses, Taoist boulder said with a smile. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, from this point of view, I have to congratulate fellow Taoist. Taoist boulder only smiled faintly and said, I invited you here this time. I do have a request. Fellow Taoist, feel free to speak. If it wasn't for your help back then, I'm afraid that I would have already died in that world. Such a great kindness cannot be easily repaid, said Luo Fan solemnly. I want to prove my Tao and become a saint again. I hope you can teach me that sage ability, Taoist boulder said as he bowed. Hearing this, Luo Fan had a look of realization. So it's because of this back then, Taoist rock's predecessor, the saint, was able to use the voice of the great Tao to explain that divine ability to him and impart all the profound mysteries of that saint divine ability to him. This was because he was a saint. He was also a saint who became a saint with the principles of that divine ability. That kind of status, that kind of power. That saint's divine ability was naturally no secret to him, so he could easily teach it to anyone with the voice of the great Tao. But now it didn't hurt anymore. Right now, he had already lost the status of a saint. Although he could still remember everything he did when he was the saint of heaven and earth, and he could even remember what he said to him. Even he was somewhat affected. However, he could no longer understand the profundities contained within the voice of the great Tao that had come out of his mouth back then. It was as if everything that had happened back then had become a scene in a movie, if he wanted to master these profound mysteries again. Someone else had to teach him these principles and these profundities so that he could start cultivating again. Only then would he be able to master that saint divine ability again. And this person was obviously Luo Fan, who he had taught back then. Ever since this saint had perished together with the saint who had corrupted Luo Fan had already placed a lot of trust in him. The profoundness of this saint divine ability had originally come from that saint. Now that he was returning it to him, he didn't hesitate at all. As such, he smiled and said, "This is only natural. Those principles originally came from you, so it's only natural that they're being returned to their rightful owner." "Thank you, fellow." Although Taoist Rock had expected this, he still couldn't help but reveal a look of joy when he heard this. This divine ability was his saint's essence. If others obtained this saint divine ability, they might need a supreme fortuitous encounter to become a false saint again. However, Taoist Rock was different. If he obtained this saint divine ability, it would be the same as obtaining a part of himself that he had lost. He would be able to break through his limits extremely easily with this divine ability and ascend to the saint position again, becoming a saint. Luo Fan's casual reply might be as easy as lifting a finger to him, but to Taoist Rock, it was equivalent to pushing him to the saint position. There are a total of 18 saints in this world. There are simply too many of them. If you want to ascend to the saint position in this world, there might be some obstacles. I've been to a world before, and there were only 3 sages there. It's just right for you to go there. If you want, I can lead you to that world, Luo Fan reminded. However, Taoist Rock shook his head and said, "Although there are many saints in this world, my current body was born from this world. If I become a saint here, I'll be blessed by the world and be spared from tribulations. However, if I'm in another world, then I'll be an outsider. Not only will the world not bless me, it'll also send down endless tribulations. When that happens, even if there are fewer saints than this world, it'll be even more difficult for me to ascend to the saint position. I see. This was the first time Luo Fan had heard of this, and he felt as if his horizons had been broadened. So there were actually such restrictions to becoming a saint. Becoming a saint in a world that wasn't one's own birth would actually cause one to encounter endless tribulations. This was beyond his expectations, but when he thought about it carefully, it seemed to make sense. To the world, a cultivator becoming a saint was equivalent to having a cultivator perfectly fusing with it. Under such circumstances, if this cultivator was born from this world, then he would be like its own child. If he fused with it, then its child would be dependent on it. Relying on itself was naturally easier to accept. However, if this cultivator who had become a saint was an outsider, then it would be equivalent to an outsider coming to be its child, completely dependent on it. If it didn't give him a test, it wouldn't be able to prove that this cultivator could be its child. How could it easily let him fuse with it and rely on it? Now that he understood, Luo Fan didn't delay any further. His heart skipped a beat. Boundless runes instantly rushed out of the cave abode and into the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. They attracted an endless amount of grayish existences, which directly constructed hundreds of trillions of layers of tight defensive formations on the surface of the cave abode, completely separating the cave abode from the outside world and causing the world to tremble. This world had almost become a completely independent small world in this world. A small world. To preach the voice of the great Tao and the magical powers of the saints, the implications were too great. If even the slightest bit of it leaked out, it could cause a storm of blood and endless trouble. In order to avoid more trouble as much as possible, Luo Fan could only do his best to defend himself like this. This kind of defense was already the limit of what Luo Fan could do. This kind of defense had the absolute ability to isolate all existences below the saint level. However, Luo Fan didn't have the slightest bit of confidence against saint-level existences. After finishing all of this, he wished he hadn't had enough. Luo Fan said to Taoist Boulder, "I'll need your help, fellow." Taoist Boulder had already lost his position as a false saint, and he couldn't even understand the true path of a saint. He needed someone to preach it to him again so that he could understand it again. However, he had once been a false saint after all. He had an understanding of the characteristics of a saint that Luo Fan couldn't compare to. If he wanted to isolate himself from the detection of a saint, he was much more confident than Luo Fan. Thus, he didn't say much. After nodding, he raised his hand and made an extremely complicated hand seal. Endless power was continuously generated in his body and surged into the hand seal, causing it to gradually condense into a physical form. It started to construct something according to an extremely grand and complicated outline in front of him. The amount of power he created out of thin air was unbelievable, and the hand seals he made were unimaginably fast. In just a few breaths' time, he had formed hundreds of millions of hand seals, and the power he had created was enough to create hundreds of great thousand worlds. However, this kind of handprint and this kind of power seemed to be extremely far away from his ultimate goal. The outline formed by the hand seals was still extremely broken, and it was still impossible to tell what it really looked like. Luo Fan watched quietly. He could vaguely sense a cultivation path that surpassed the false saint level, but it seemed to be right, but it was actually wrong, as if something was missing. Recalling Taoist Boulder's identity, Luo Fan suddenly understood what he was missing. What he was missing was the true saint's path. At this moment, although this god power had already surpassed the false saint level, and vaguely had a hint of a saint's god power, it was only formed by a forceful method. Taoist Boulder had used his own wisdom and methods that were millions of times more complicated than before to forcefully imitate that saint's god power. To be able to forcefully imitate a saint's god power with a god power that did not contain the saint's god power while forgetting about the saint's god power, such wisdom was naturally shocking. However, at the same time, this was clearly a choice he made because he had no other choice. If Taoist Boulder was still a saint, he wouldn't even need to make so many hand seals. He would only need to casually slap it, and he would be able to form this god power. Furthermore, the amount of power he would expend would be negligible, unlike now, where he had to make hundreds of millions of hand seals at every moment and expend enough power to construct a large thousand world. He had to spend a few days to finally complete this god power. Moreover, the power of the completed mystical ability was much weaker than the true pseudo-sage mystical ability. 3 days later, Taoist Boulder made the last hand seal. The instant he channeled the last bit of power into the huge sphere formed by the hand seals, the sphere suddenly shook. The sphere suddenly shook and began to expand crazily. In the blink of an eye, it had filled the entire universe and the entire cave abode. It completely enveloped the entire cave abode, and formed a defensive layer that gave off an eternal and indestructible aura. It gradually fused with the countless layers of defensive formations that Luo Fan had formed around it, causing them to fuse into one. After this change, the defensive formation did not give off the eternal and indestructible aura of a saint. Instead, it directly disappeared from the world, along with the cave abode that Luo Fan had created. This area, where the gravity was so strong that even light could not escape, was restored to its original appearance before Luo Fan arrived. It looked like an empty space. It looked like an empty space, as if there was nothing there. In this case, it shouldn't be a problem to block ordinary spying from a saint. Taoist Boulder sighed. He specifically added the word ordinary in front of spying. It was obvious that if a saint just casually glanced over, they could naturally be blocked. However, if a saint wanted to spy on them and focused all of their attention on this place, this kind of defense would definitely not be able to block out that kind of spying. Although it was a pity, it was already rather heaven-defying for someone who was not a saint to be able to do this. Even if it was Luo Fan, they could only admire him, and did not dare to have any more extravagant requests. At this moment, a figure suddenly crossed the air and arrived outside this forbidden area. This figure was one of the Supreme Supremacies who had arrived after Taoist Boulder's main body had left. He was also the last one to leave. The Supreme Supremacies who said that the Boulder was a part of the Creator's body. After this cultivator arrived, he frowned. What's going on? Just now, all the karma and luck were pointing here. Why have they suddenly disappeared? He frowned and searched this area bit by bit. However, he was filled with doubts. As a Supreme Supremacies, this person naturally had endless tricks up his sleeves. Previously, he had spent 3 days to deduce the location of Luo Fan and Taoist Boulder through the connection between karma and luck, as well as the traces left behind at the scene. However, when he rushed here excitedly, he suddenly realized that the feeling that he had felt before had completely disappeared. It was as if all the effort he had put in during the past 3 days had been for naught. This change made him feel extremely aggrieved. Even as a Supreme Supremacies, his expression could not help but turn rather grim. He deduced carefully for a moment. In the end, he noticed that even though there was a formidable obstruction, the karma and luck of those two that he could barely deduce had actually vanished completely at this moment. It caused him to be unable to deduce the location of those two no matter how he searched or how hard he tried. How's this possible? At this moment, the Supreme Supremacies could not help but exclaim. As a Supreme Supremacies, the only people in this world that he could not deduce karma and luck were the dozen or so sages in this world. Apart from them, he could even vaguely deduce some information about the disciples of sages. Now, he could clearly deduce the karma and luck of the people who he could clearly deduce earlier, but now, he could no longer sense or deduce them. This almost overturned his worldview. Could it be that one of them suddenly became a sage? No, that's impossible. There must be a phenomenon when one becomes a sage, and it can't be suppressed. There was no phenomenon at all just now, so it's impossible that one of them became a sage. With this thought, a greedy glint like that of a wolf's suddenly appeared in his eyes. They're not sages, but there's such an effect. Could it be that one of them has grasped a sage's godly power? A sage's godly power was a type of godly power that contained the Tao of gods. It was extremely difficult to cultivate such a godly power, and it required great opportunities and great luck to have a chance of cultivating it. However, once it was successfully cultivated, its power would surpass everything and reach a level that only sages could resist. As long as anyone cultivated a sage's godly power, no matter what their cultivation realm was, they would become the most powerful person below the sages. They would become an invincible existence below the sages. This supreme supremacy was naturally very clear about this fact. At this moment, when he thought that there was a sage's godly power in front of him, his heart burned with greed. Originally, he only wanted to study the rock that might be a part of the Creator's body, but now, he was determined to find them. He was determined to obtain that sage's godly power that they had grasped. Although the direction of his deduction was completely wrong, the conclusion that he came to was coincidental. It was actually unimaginably correct. With that determination in his heart, this supreme supremacy gritted his teeth and raised his hand to poke his heart. His body, which was originally so strong that it could almost ignore the ultimate attack of a level 9 pseudo-sage, was instantly poked by his finger like tofu. With this poke, he frowned, and a hint of pain flashed in his eyes. It was not only because of the pain in his body, but also because of the reluctance in his heart. Then, he raised his hand and a ball of essence blood appeared in his hand. This ball of essence blood was not just crystal clear. It was like the most beautiful and high-end crystal in the world. Inside it, there were countless worlds being born and destroyed at every moment, giving birth to countless living beings. However, it gave birth to countless cultivators and infinite cultivation wisdom. From the looks of it, it looked like a vast and boundless group of worlds. This was the core essence blood of an ultimate supremacy. It contained the essence of all the cultivation paths of the ultimate supremacy. If any part of it fell out freely, it would evolve into countless worlds and give birth to countless living beings. Such a core essence blood. Even an ultimate supremacy's strength would be greatly reduced if he lost even a little bit of it. He would need a long time to recover. When this supreme supremacy dug out the core essence blood, he was so reluctant and heartbroken. However, now that he had really dug it out, he no longer hesitated. At that moment, endless power was directly poured into the core essence blood, causing it to explode. Endless blood light was born and a figure was condensed in the void. The figure looked very similar to the Supreme Venerable One. It looked like they were made from the same mold. After the figure appeared, its body suddenly rushed into the long river of luck that was born out of nothingness, and it began to constantly shift between the luck worlds. Every time it shifted, the figure would become a little fainter, and every time it shifted, it would become a little weaker. It was obvious that every time the figure moved, it would consume a great deal of his energy. At this moment, the power in the body of the ultimate supremacy fluctuated rapidly, and endless runes were born in his body. They rushed out of his body and disappeared into the void, flowing along some mysterious channel to an unknown place. Each of these runes was unimaginably complicated. If an ordinary person accidentally saw these runes, even if it was the most ordinary and simple one, they would definitely not be able to withstand the terrifying information contained in the runes. Their brains would definitely explode, and their minds would collapse. And at this moment, billions of such runes were born almost every second. They vaguely formed a long river in the void, flowing along some mysterious channel from his body to an unknown place. At the same time, the holy decree that he had obtained also directly appeared at this moment. It also fluctuated slightly and produced an extremely subtle and mysterious resonance with the figure that was constantly moving around in the long river of luck. It constantly adjusted the direction that the figure was moving in, changing the direction that the figure was moving in, and changing the world that he entered. It seemed like he was looking for what he was looking for in the endless luck worlds, the luck world that belonged to Luo Fan or the boulder. The figure was moving between the luck world. It was a huge consumption for the figure himself, but it was also a considerable consumption for this person. Moreover, this consumption was not the power that could be created and born at any time, but his energy. Although he was an ultimate supremacy and had unlimited energy, the consumption of each move was also almost unlimited. Chapter 1478. As the Supreme Venerable made his move, his core blood, which had turned into his silhouette, gradually locked onto the luck path world in the long river of luck path. Watermark advertisement test. Watermark advertisement test. Looking at its range, it was gradually approaching an illusory luck world. If Luo Fan observed the river of luck at this moment, he would definitely notice that the luck world was the Taoist boulder's luck world. The river of luck was divided into levels. Luo Fan's luck world was on the second level at the moment. It was the luck world of a cultivator who had yet to become a saint, but had surpassed ordinary cultivators who had absolute control over the world Great Tao. Normally speaking, if it was a sage's luck world, it would not appear on this level. Instead, it would appear on the third level. Unfortunately, while the Taoist boulder was a saint in the past, he was only a fake one. There was an essential difference between him and a real saint. When the difference was applied to the luck world, it was the difference between their levels. The Taoist boulder's luck world was not like a real saint's, which was on the third level of the river of luck. Instead, it was on the second level. It was on the same level as Luo Fan. It was also on the same level as ordinary venerable ones, pseudo-saint cultivators, and even quasi-saints and innate zenith heaven cultivators. The structure of the river of luck was compatible to the lower levels. In other words, existences on the upper level could sense and touch all the luck worlds on the lower level at will. However, it was completely impossible for the existences in the lower layer of the river of luck to come into contact with or even sense all the luck worlds in the upper layer of the river of luck. That was why the Venerable One was able to use various unknown methods and the karma between the Taoist boulder and the world at this moment. He traced the source and finally locked onto the Taoist boulder's luck world within a certain range. Although there were also countless luck Tao worlds within that range, there were still countless luck Tao worlds. However, compared to the endless luck worlds in the entire river of luck, it was like a drop of water in the ocean. But it was already extremely accurate. To the Supreme Venerable, being able to lock onto the range to such a precise extent was extremely taxing. The consumption was so great that it had almost exceeded his limit. In that instant, he was in the luck Tao world. The human figure formed by his core blood essence collapsed in an instant. Despite that, the boundless runes that gushed out of the Supreme Venerable One's body changed at once. The river that was initially in the form of a whirlpool seemed to have turned into a whirlpool. Along with this change, the crimson light formed by the core blood essence suddenly condensed. It completely covered the area in the river of luck that he had locked onto. Then, the blood-red light began to burn crazily, turning into flames. At the same time, it continuously burned those luck Tao world. Such a change was a great calamity for the boundless luck world. The boundless number of living beings were ignited in an instant. Although those luck realms did not collapse because of this, and the number of life forms within them was increasing as they were being burned to ashes, they were still rapidly being born, barely keeping those life forms from going extinct. But this sort of change had already made the owners of the luck Tao incomparably unlucky. The river of luck Tao was in a state of chaos, and it connected the boundless perfect worlds that were in a state of chaos. Any location within the boundless worlds could be formed by countless perfect worlds, as well as the Luck Dao worlds of all the living beings in those worlds. According to that logic, the area where the Taoist boulders river of Luck Dao was located might contain the earth, the universe, the primordial world, the ninely world, the mysterious yang world, and so on and so forth, and the Luck Dao worlds of all the living beings in the boundless worlds. That being said, that was impossible in reality. The reason the river of Luck Dao could be formed was due to the connection between the various Luck Dao worlds. The connection was karma, which was an even more subtle connection between Luck Dao. Therefore, those that gathered together were existences that had the closest connection with each other. In other words, the many Luck Dao worlds within a certain range of Taoist boulders' Luck Dao world could not possibly be formed from the Luck Dao worlds of all the living beings in the universe. Instead, they were all Luck Dao worlds of all the living beings in the universe. This was because only the living beings in the universe would have a closer karmic connection with him, as well as a Luck Dao world under the circumstances when the Supreme Venerable Boulder used such a large-scale attack. The living beings affected covered every region in the universe. Almost every living being that had a karmic connection with Taoist Boulder in the past or would have a karmic connection with him in the future suddenly felt like they were under some unknown attack. An indescribable irritation appeared out of nowhere. In fact, their luck seemed to have deteriorated by a lot. It was as if nothing was going smoothly, and even drinking water had to get stuck in one's teeth. For a time, it was unknown how many living beings died because of this, and some even directly perished, their souls scattered. They really couldn't be more dead. The Supreme Venerable Boulder did not care at all. As someone who had cultivated for trillions of years to reach his current cultivation realm as a supreme exalt, he had seen so many deaths that he could not even count them all. The number of worlds that he had personally destroyed could even be counted in trillions of worlds. Under such circumstances, if some living beings he didn't know became unlucky or died, how could he care about that? At this moment, his thoughts surged as he controlled the blood light to burn the worlds of luck. He worked hard to find what he was looking for, the level 9 pseudo-divine monolith that might have the ability of a sage. The Luck Dao world of ordinary people and the Luck Dao world of experts were naturally worlds apart. The Supreme Venerable One knew this very well. Under the burning of his core essence blood, the luck worlds of ordinary living beings were quickly destroyed. They were invaded by the blood flames and all living beings were set on fire. But if it was the luck world of an expert, it would naturally produce a powerful defensive ability that could block the blood-colored flames. Under the blood-colored flames, the Luck Dao world was protected. Therefore, the more difficult it was to invade a world, the more likely it was that expert's Luck Dao world. This was a Supreme Venerable. He used this method to determine which Luck Dao world was the Luck Dao world of the expert formed by the monolith. In the end, when almost all the blood-colored flames were consumed, he finally completed this process. He locked his target on a Luck Dao world. On the surface, this Luck Dao world didn't seem to be much different from the Luck Dao world of ordinary living beings. At a glance, it was the kind that would be ignored. Such a Luck Dao world was the one with the strongest defense against his blood-colored flames in this region. At this moment, his blood-colored flames had burned this area for a long time and almost destroyed all the living beings in the Luck Dao world hundreds of times. However, this Luck Dao world was still extremely sturdy and blocked the flames outside. Not only were the living beings in the Luck Dao world not damaged by the flames, but the Luck Dao world itself also seemed to have an invisible layer of defense that isolated the flames. The Luck Dao world seemed to have an invisible layer of defense that isolated the flames and prevented them from coming into contact with the flames. The Supreme Venerable One couldn't think of a Luck Dao world other than the living being formed by the monolith. Anyone else could have it. I finally found you. At this moment, the Supreme Venerable had already locked onto the Luck Dao world and had a smug look on his face. However, that sage's divine ability is really powerful. It can even protect the Luck Dao world like this. If I hadn't used this method of elimination instead of searching directly, I might not have been able to lock onto this Luck Dao world in the end. With that thought, the holy decree on his body gradually retracted. The runes that were gushing out of his body also gradually decreased. As the runes decreased, the blood-colored flames that were lingering in the Luck Dao river for a while finally collapsed and disappeared. After locking onto the Luck Dao world, it wasn't difficult for the Supreme Venerable to use the Luck Dao world to find the location of the owner of the Luck Dao world. Even if the Luck Dao world was being protected by an unbelievable power and he couldn't invade it at all, it was still the same. Let me see where exactly you are now. With that thought, with the help of the Luck Dao world's characteristics, endless runes, and patterns began to flash in his mind. If any of these runes, and patterns were taken out, any cultivator who was determined to deduce the Tao would give up everything in exchange for them. Through the endless words, runes, and diagrams, he was gradually able to grasp traces of it. The traces pointed to a certain location in the area in front of him. Moreover, as he continued to deduce, the range of the traces began to shrink. In the end, he locked onto a small spot. An extremely special spot that seemed no different from the other locations, but in his eyes, it was a small spot that was strangely resonating with the Luck Dao world. After locking onto the small spot, the Supreme Venerable's pale face lit up with a smile. "Come on. Let me see the power of a sage's divine ability." He shouted and lifted his hand, causing a hanging plate to appear above his head. The plate was densely covered with countless complicated runes. Furthermore, these runes were constantly undergoing unimaginable changes. The changes were so complicated that an ordinary cultivator's mind would be sucked into the hanging plate and become a part of it, while their body would become a living dead. This hanging plate was a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. More specifically, it was an ultimate venerables treasure. At that moment, the treasure was emitting an extremely faint aura. It was an aura that was eternal and indestructible. It was the aura of a holy will. This aura was at least 100 times fainter than the holy will that the Supreme Venerable possessed. However, it was already the aura of a holy will. With this aura, the power of this treasure had far surpassed that of an ordinary level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. It was enough to be called an ultimate venerables treasure. After the treasure appeared, the Supreme Venerable raised his hand and pointed at it. The holy will on his body poured into the center of the treasure without holding back. With the injection of the holy will, the endless complicated runes on the hanging plate began to multiply wildly. Each rune turned into countless runes in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the number of runes had increased by 100 times. Moreover, the speed and complexity of its rotation had increased by more than 100 times. After the changes, a ray of light. It shot out from the hanging plate. This ray of light. It was an extremely complicated and heterogeneous light. It seemed to contain the charm of seeing through everything, connecting everything, and communicating everything. This ray of light directly shot into the small spot that the Supreme Venerable had locked onto. As the ray of light shot into it, the space-time within a radius of billions of miles began to vibrate violently. In an instant, countless thoughts were focused on this place from all directions. These were the thoughts of the pseudo-sage existences in this world. When these consciousnesses saw everything that had happened here, all the consciousnesses were instantly reduced by 999%. However, almost all of them did not dare to let their curiosities spread because they recognized the identity of the Supreme Venerable. They retracted their thoughts. Only the Supreme Venerables who were confident of being comparable to the Supreme Venerable ignored the Supreme Venerable and wanted to find out what was happening here. The Supreme Venerable's expression was extremely ugly at this moment. The appearance of these thoughts was beyond his expectations. The moment these thoughts appeared, he instantly knew who the owners of these thoughts were. He instantly knew who the owners of these consciousnesses were. He knew that almost every single one of them was a powerful existence that could rival him. Damn it, why is there such a huge commotion? He cursed in his heart. At this moment, an extremely shocking scene appeared in front of him. Countless layers of formations that surpassed the sum of the countless formations he had seen in his life were stacked in front of him, completely enveloping the space-time within a radius of 1,000,000 miles in front of him. On the surface of these formations, there was a great existence that was more advanced and more powerful than his holy decree, faintly flowing, brewing some kind of earth-shattering power. Such a scene had completely subverted the limits of his imagination. He stared blankly at the scene in front of him, suddenly feeling extremely regretful for the little bit of core essence and blood that he had previously consumed. Putting aside the existence that was even more powerful and mighty than the holy will that was hidden behind the formation, just the terrifying formation that was formed from countless interweaving layers of formations was enough to make him lose the will to resist it. And this obviously meant that the core blood essence that he had lost earlier was obviously lost in vain. Now that he had found it, he had no way to fight it on his own. He had no way to break through this terrifying defense. How could he achieve his goal? If he couldn't achieve his goal, then this core blood essence would naturally be lost without any value. While he was feeling heartbroken and regretful, the Supreme Venerable Ones, who had focused their thoughts on this place, saw a great opportunity. In the blink of an eye, they each unleashed their own powerful abilities and crossed through space. Almost in the blink of an eye, over 600 Supreme Venerables had already appeared. Over 600 powerful holy wills soared into the sky and shook the space-time, causing it to seem like the residence of a saint. The unpredictable and unusual environment was instantly suppressed, causing a rare sight that could only be seen in a normal world to appear in this region. Normal gravity, normal weather, normal heaven and earth. Fellow Taoist Mad Lord, you're the first one here. Do you know the origin of this formation? One of the Venerable Ones asked the Venerable who had lost his core blood essence. His words made the expression of the Venerable, who was also the Mad Lord, change drastically. Who said I'm the first one here? This is an opportunity that I've derived by consuming my core blood essence. Are you trying to snatch my opportunity by force? Upon hearing that, the other Supreme Venerable Ones looked at each other with smiles in their eyes. The Mad Lord is indeed the Mad Lord. Your ability to derive things is truly unparalleled. Since fellow Taoist Mad Lord said that this is your opportunity, why don't you break this formation and retrieve the treasure inside? Another Venerable suggested. His words made the Mad Lord's expression turn even uglier. No matter what, this is my opportunity. Even if you break the formation, the final treasure will be mine. This is my fate. The Mad Lord yelled. As the Mad Lord, he was famous for two things. Firstly, his ability to derive things. As someone who could meticulously manipulate the worlds of Luck Path in the long river of Luck Path. As someone who could manipulate others through these worlds of Luck Path, it was needless to say how powerful his ability to derive things was. In this entire world, almost no one could compare to him. Secondly, it was his insanity. The Mad Lord's heart was in a state of chaos that other Venerables did not possess. Such chaos. It made him seem extremely stubborn, and his style was completely unlike that of a Venerable. He did not even seem like a cultivator. Even a wise ordinary person would not do something that was akin to ridicule the group. However, the Mad Lord did it without any hesitation. To the Mad Lord, such a thing. He had already done too much. He had offended far too many fellow Taoists. If it wasn't for his invincible ability to derive things, he would have been killed countless times with his personality and style. Everyone looked at each other, and wisely chose to ignore the Mad Lord. Their past experience told them. If they wanted to kill the Mad Lord, he would naturally sense it. By then, he would escape as fast as he could and use all means to attack them. He would use all means to make you yield, and make it impossible for you to harm him. However, as long as you ignored him, he would fall into his own world after a while and forget about the conflict in the blink of an eye. This formation is only secondary. Although its complexity exceeds the limits of imagination, it's still not enough. Although its complexity is beyond our imagination, its profoundness is still within our understanding. Most importantly, it's the strange existence beneath the formation. It goes beyond the limits of our understanding. I feel like it might be a type of saint item, a supreme expert said. Almost all of the venerables agreed with him. Each of them attempted to become a sage. Although they failed, they obtained a sage's decree, and they were the ones who had the most say in matters related to sages. Therefore, they could tell what the most crucial part of the formation was at a glance. Otherwise, they would not have crossed the void and come here as soon as they saw the formation. But the sages and venerables didn't do anything. Could there be a problem? Another venerable frowned and asked. There were 18 sages in the world. These sages were omniscient and omnipotent existences in this world. None of the supreme venerable ones would believe that they did not know what was going on here, since they had clearly sensed the commotion here, but none of them had come here. None of them had sent their power here. In fact, they had even sent everything else here to deal with the formation. That was something worth pondering. Everyone was wise, so who would not have thought of that? In an instant, everyone stopped what they were planning to do. They hovered in the void and quietly observed the formation, waiting for the others to make the first move, as long as they were slightly affected by the sage's schemes. Even if they were supreme venerable ones, they would definitely die. Any rational person would not dare to make a move recklessly after knowing that. They were rational people. There was clearly an venerable who was known as a lunatic in the world. The others dared not make a move, but the mad lord pondered carefully. After weighing his options, he brazenly made a move and threw his venerable lord's treasure into the formation in front of him. The artifact of the mad lord was an extremely incredible artifact of divination. Its offensive and defensive abilities might only be average, but its ability to make deductions was so great that it surpassed the imagination of supreme venerable ones. The instant it was thrown into the formation, it began to absorb the attacks that burst out of nowhere, which could destroy millions of worlds and universes. It kept turning them into clues to make a prediction. At this moment, the crazy venerable's body was trembling slightly, and his eyes were filled with an indescribable determination. Chapter 1479. However, even though the divinatory plate was under such a terrifying attack, it did not gain nothing. The runes that appeared on it kept increasing and changing, gradually forming various combinations that did not originally exist on the divinatory plate. Even if the other venerables saw these combinations, they would know that they were the profundities of the huge formation in front of them. As the time that the divinatory plate was in the formation increased, and as the attacks on it increased, the runes on the divinatory plate kept increasing. In just a short while, the number of runes on the divinatory disk had increased by a few hundred times compared to when it had first appeared. Vaguely, some of them could no longer be arranged on the divinatory plate. At this moment, the Mad Lord's expression changed drastically, and he shouted, "Are you just going to watch? If you want a share of the loot, hand over your holy intentions to me now. Otherwise, I won't be able to hold on any longer." As he spoke, runes began to scatter from his divinatory plate. Although the runes that had scattered out were still closely connected to the divination plate, they could still return to the divination plate and combine with the many runes on it to form various combinations that could display the mysteries of the array. However, it was obvious that it was already quite forceful. The divinatory plate could no longer bear the burden. If this went on, the runes would soon be completely out of its control, and it would no longer be able to derive the formation's profundities. Many supreme venerables were present. Which one of them had bad eyesight? However, everyone instantly knew that the crazy venerable wasn't lying. At that moment, everyone fell into silence as countless thoughts flashed through their minds. Due to their scruples towards the saints, most of them would not make a move before they had made up their minds. However, there were naturally hundreds of supreme venerables with different personalities. One of the adventurous venerables gritted his teeth and released his holy decree, pouring it straight into the divinatory disk in the middle of the formation. There were 8 supreme venerables who did the same. Together with the Mad Lord, they were the 9 supreme venerables with 9 holy intentions. With the support of the 8 new holy intentions, the divinatory disk suddenly stopped moving. Its size instantly increased by 100-fold. The runes that were originally densely packed and had almost exceeded the limit of the 8-trigram disk seemed insignificant in the face of this enlarged 8-trigram disk. It was so sparse. With the support of these 8 holy wills, the Venerable of Mad Wind became even more powerful. His body suddenly froze. In an instant, the terrifying attack that was transmitted from the divinatory plate seemed to have weakened a lot at this moment. It made him feel much better. As the divinatory disk changed, the formation was stimulated and changed as well. The attacks that were directed at it became more intense and powerful. Faintly, one world after another appeared in the midst of the attack, and then exploded. Life and death continued, forming an extremely terrifying attack. If these attacks were unleashed outside the formation, even in the current world, the spacetime within hundreds of millions of miles would be completely destroyed. Even the laws and laws would be completely destroyed. However, inside the formation, when facing the divinatory disk, these attacks were just the most ordinary and common kind of attack. It was just one of the most ordinary attacks among the hundreds of millions of attacks. The divinatory disk used these attacks to derive the mysteries of the formation. As the attacks increased, the divinatory disk's derivation of the formation's mysteries became faster and smoother. The speed at which the runes emerged from the divinatory disk was more than 100 times faster than before. In almost the blink of an eye, the number of runes on the divinatory disk doubled. Just like that, the divinatory disk, which had expanded by 100 times, was once again filled up. How strong is the person who set up this formation? Even a divination treasure supported by 9 holy intentions can't derive anything. The surrounding supreme venerables finally couldn't help but be shocked. They could clearly see that the formation's mysteries that were derived from the divinatory disk were 100 times more profound than the most complicated formation that they could set up. However, even so, it seemed like it was only an extremely insignificant small part of the profound mysteries of this formation. Just how complicated was this formation? Just how powerful was the person who had set up this formation? It really caused them to be indescribably shocked when they thought about it, leaving only a dreadful feeling in their hearts. Apart from the spectators, even the 8 supreme venerables who were using their holy intents to help the Mad Lord's magic treasure to derive the formation were astonished. Their holy intents were obtained after they failed to break through to the Saint Realm, and they were formed from their comprehension after coming into contact with the Saint's path. Putting their holy intents into the divinatory disk would naturally increase its power by a large margin. For these supreme venerables, it was equivalent to them joining the divinatory disk themselves to sense its work and reap the results of its derivations. Therefore, as compared to the other supreme venerable ones who were watching from the side, they knew more than the others. As a result, they had a better understanding of exactly how many mysteries the divinatory disk had obtained and how many inconceivable mysteries it had deduced at this moment compared to the supreme venerables. At this moment, the mysteries derived by the divinatory disk were not only 100 times more profound than the formations that these supreme venerables could set up, but the depth and breadth of the mysteries were also 100 times greater than what these supreme venerables could achieve. To put it in a more understandable way, this formation did not look like it had been set up by a level 9 fake sage or a supreme venerable. Instead, it looked like a crude formation that had been set up by a sage in an unbelievably casual way, They were excited when they discovered this. They were worried. They were excited because they were accepting the principles and mysteries derived from the derivations, which would greatly benefit their cultivation in the future. They might even obtain the ability to break through to the saint realm again. As for what they were worried about, it was even simpler. If the formation in front of them was really set up by a saint, what they were doing now was simply courting death. If the person who set up the formation became impatient and pinched them, they would also die. This feeling of excitement and worry. It caused their expressions to change slightly. As their emotions changed, the mad venerable roared again, "I can't hold on any longer. I need more holy intents. Otherwise, I won't be able to hold on any longer." Hearing this, the surroundings paused for a moment. At this very moment, inside the formation, the runes on the divinatory disk that had been enlarged by 100 times were overflowing once again. Countless runes left the divinatory disk and began to revolve around it. Because the divinatory disk had been enlarged by 100 times, the number of runes that rushed out of it, naturally, it was at least 100 times more than before. In an instant, a huge cloud of smoke was formed around the divinatory disk that was getting denser and denser. It directly engulfed the divinatory disk, and the divinatory disk continued to churn and change. Although it looked more mysterious and wonderful than the lone divinatory disk from before, everyone could see the danger it contained. This was a sign that the divinatory disk was about to reach its limit. When everyone saw this clearly, dozens of venerables let out a soft cry and suddenly poured their holy intents into the formation and into the divinatory disk. In an instant, the divinatory disk that was originally supported by 9 holy intents was now supported by 72 holy intent. With the support of these 72 holy intents, the divinatory disk that had been enlarged by 100 times was greatly strengthened once again. In the blink of an eye, it had grown to 100 times its original size. In other words, it had grown to more than 10,000 times its original size. Although the mad venerable made the same request as before, because the situation had changed, the number of venerables that responded to his request had increased by almost 10 times. This was not strange. After all, it was like the first person to eat the crab and the second person to eat the crab. The first person to eat the crab required at least 10 times more courage than the second person to eat the crab. That was because the first person to eat the crab clearly didn't know that the crab was edible. He didn't know if he would lose his life after eating the crab. Under such circumstances, one could imagine the courage and boldness required to eat the crab. However, the second person to eat the crab was different. There was already a precedent before him. Although it still required great courage to eat the crab, at least compared to the first person to eat the crab, the requirement for courage was not as high. The current situation was the same. The 8 people who responded to the mad venerable's request for the first time were the first people to eat the crab. As for the ones who responded now, it was equivalent to the second person to eat the crab. With the support of the newly added holy intents, the divinatory disk had indeed received great benefits. It expanded by 10,000 times, causing the runes that could not be accommodated to become insignificant again. The space was increased by 100 times to accommodate the appearance of the new runes. However, the Mad Lord's reaction was not as wonderful. With the addition of the 8 holy wills, he had indeed obtained great benefits. He could feel that the divinatory disk's power had increased tremendously, and his understanding of the Tao of divination had also been enhanced. But now, when the number of holy wills had reached 71, there was a new change in the situation. The more holy wills, the better. Every strand of saint decree was the comprehension of the saint's Tao that a level 9 pseudo-saint obtained the moment he touched the saint's Tao when he tried to break through to the saint realm. This kind of comprehension had the characteristics of absolute self. Even if others obtained it, they would only be able to use its power. They would not be able to transform it into their own comprehension, and they would not be able to become a true Supreme Venerable under such circumstances. If a Supreme Venerable obtained a small amount of holy wills and comprehended the cultivation paths of other Supreme Venerables, he would indeed be able to comprehend other things by analogy and gain more understanding of his own cultivation path, allowing him to make greater progress. However, if the number of holy wills exceeded a certain limit, the way of cultivation contained within them would become even more profound. In turn, it would interfere with his way of cultivation. In the end, he would become the host, and his own way of cultivation would be overshadowed by the way of cultivation contained within the other holy wills. The current Mad Lord was in such a situation. 10 strands of holy wills was already his limit. Now, the number of holy wills had increased to 72, 71 holy wills from other people and 1 from himself, but this was already far beyond what he could bear. Countless thoughts surged in his mind, greatly affecting his control over the divinatory disk, and he faintly felt that he was unable to control it. H*T. I can't believe there's such a change, the Mad Lord thought to himself at this moment. Although he was known as the Mad Lord, he was not a true lunatic. After all, he was still an ultimate venerable. Even if his obsession was a little strong, and his actions were a little unscrupulous, he would not do things that did not benefit him. After all, he was still an ultimate venerable. Even if his obsession was a little strong, and his actions were a little unscrupulous, he took the initiative to send the divinatory disk into the formation to deduce the mysteries of the formation. Of course, he wanted to completely deduce the mysteries of the formation. Then, he would charge into the formation and try to snatch the saint's divine ability. However, more importantly, he wanted to lure the other saints to send their holy wills into his divinatory disk. That way, he could borrow the power of the divinatory disk to transfer the mysteries of the saint's will into his heart. To any ultimate venerable, the holy wills were their most important treasures. Under normal circumstances, no one would give their holy wills to other ultimate venerables to comprehend. This was especially so for an ultimate venerable like the Mad Lord, who did not have a good reputation in this world, and no one was willing to pay attention to him. In the trillions of years before today, he had only obtained the remnant holy wills of a few ancient venerables by chance, and could be considered to have comprehended the holy wills of others. Under such circumstances, he naturally would not have thought that after increasing the holy wills to a certain extent, they would not be beneficial to him, but instead cause such a disturbance to his cultivation. At this moment, he was at a loss as to what to do. The others naturally didn't know that the crazy lord was already in a difficult situation. They only looked at the changes in the divinatory plate in astonishment. They watched the runes increase at an unimaginable speed on the divinatory plate, as well as the various mysteries of the formation that the runes had evolved from the runes who set up this formation. Is this really something that someone who has not become a saint can set up? Such thoughts gradually emerged in the hearts of the crowd. Suddenly, the divinatory disk shook, as if it had broken through a certain limit. The runes on it instantly changed, and they began to condense in the center of the divinatory disk. A world of runes gradually appeared on the divinatory disk. How powerful were the many ultimate venerables present, and how rich were their knowledge! They could instantly tell that this world of runes was not formed by the power of the divinatory disk, but by the runes themselves. In other words, the mysteries of the formation attracted each other, interacted with each other, and naturally condensed to form this world. How is this possible? At this moment, all the ultimate venerables had the same thought. Everything in front of them was already beyond their imagination. It was clearly just a deduction of the mysteries, and it was clearly just a reflection of the principles of the formation. How could such an unbelievable change occur, and it could actually condense a world naturally? Naturally, the world of runes would not stop evolving because of the disbelief of the ultimate venerables. After it took shape, it began to frantically absorb the runes that had appeared on the 8 trigram disk, continuously absorbing them into the world of runes. It continuously contributed to the perfection of the world, causing the world of runes to become clearer and clearer, causing the structure of the world to become more and more complete. It was an extremely strange world. It looked like a starry sky in the universe. In the entire world, stars made of runes scattered countless runes throughout the world of runes. The void formed by the runes and the planets formed by the runes continuously absorbed these runes, and after various transformations, different runes were emitted. These runes merged into the void, and after some extremely subtle transformations, they once again merged into the stars, allowing the stars to continuously emit these endless runes. Even on those planets, in the void and even within the stars, faint vitality was gradually formed. This vitality evolved extremely quickly, absorbing the runes and gradually turning into countless living creatures. The wonderful world of runes that existed in the real world, as well as the world of runes, became more complete and more obvious. Just as the world of runes appeared, the divinatory disk started to make a cracking sound. It vaguely seemed like it could no longer withstand the existence of the world of runes. Everyone looked over. How could they not understand? It was clear that the divinatory disk could no longer withstand the mysteries of the formation. Almost instinctively, all the supreme venerables sent out their holy wills and poured them directly into the divinatory disk. Such a change! The mad sovereign almost screamed out in pain. He was already unable to withstand the 72 holy wills. He could almost feel that his control over the divinatory disk was already affected. Even his thoughts had become extremely sluggish. Now that hundreds of holy wills were suddenly poured in, how could he handle it? In an instant, he felt that he had completely lost control over the divinatory disk, and his state of mind was transmitted from the divinatory disk. The mysteries of the hundreds of holy wills were directly concealed, and his own cultivation path was directly mixed within the hundreds of holy wills. He could no longer find or control it. His body was tempered by the fundamental changes he had undergone after attaining the holy will. Now, he could not control his own cultivation path at all, nor could he sense his own cultivation path. In an instant, he lost control of his body. Although he looked like he was standing there, he had already become a statue. Oh no! The mad sovereign sighed in his heart. At this moment, there were hundreds of mysteries of the holy wills in his heart. Each of these mysteries was mysterious and unfathomable, and each of them contained a bit of the secrets of the path of the sage. When they were mixed together, they formed a palace of the path of the sage that he had yearned for. However, his cultivation path had also become a part of this palace, and he could no longer find it. Even if he wanted to start cultivating his own cultivation path again, he would not be able to succeed due to the countless interferences. In other words, the mad sovereign could only quietly wait for the divinatory disk to malfunction and stop transmitting the mysteries of the holy wills. Only then would he be able to recover. None of the supreme venerables outside noticed that the mad sovereign was in such a predicament. At this moment, the supreme venerables were extremely excited, and all of them were fully focused on the rune world on the divinatory disk. The hundreds of holy wills that they had poured in had completely stabilized the divinatory disk, and it no longer let out that crackling sound. Moreover, there was a faint aura of eternity and indestructibility that kept seeping out of it. This was not the aura of any holy will, but the aura of the divinatory disk. The divinatory disk had endured the erosion and refinement of the hundreds of holy wills. Unknowingly, it had already been imprinted with the mysteries of the path of the sage. However, it had obtained its own holy decree in a way that was different from the ultimate venerable. This holy will was different from the wisps of holy will that the mad sovereign had bestowed upon it previously. The wisps of holy will that the mad sovereign had bestowed upon it were his own holy will. Even if this artifact was the mad sovereign's life artifact, it could not be exactly the same as the mad sovereign. No matter what, the Mad Sovereign's holy will could not be completely compatible with it, and it could not be his true holy will. Therefore, after obtaining the Mad Sovereign's holy will, although this artifact had become an ultimate venerable's treasure, it was essentially the same as a level 9 pseudo-saint who had grasped someone else's holy will to become an ultimate venerable. However, it was not a true ultimate venerable's artifact, and could only be considered as an ultimate venerable's artifact. Only now, after the transformation and obtaining the saint's will, did this magical treasure truly become the treasure of a supreme being. After this artifact had grown to its current stage, a vague intent was gradually born within the artifact. Under normal circumstances, this artifact should have been directly erased by the Mad Sovereign or fused with him. However, now that the Mad Sovereign had completely lost control of the divinatory disk due to the hundreds of holy wills covering it, how could he possibly erase the intent that was born within the artifact? Immediately, the intent of the artifact began to grow and strengthen. Chapter 1480. This transformation was completely happening inside the divinatory disk. At this moment, the numerous venerables were only paying attention to the mysterious rune world on the divinatory disk. Why would anyone care about the transformation happening inside the divinatory disk? As such, the will of a magic treasure was born on the divinatory plate, then it entered the world of runes. Not a single supreme venerable one noticed the entire process. Of course, apart from the Mad Lord, the other venerables wouldn't care even if they noticed this. It wasn't their treasure after all. What did it have to do with them if it had developed intelligence and some hidden dangers of control? After this transformation, the scene in the rune world also began to change subtly. Changes. The speed at which living beings were born became faster and faster. In fact, there was even a creature that gradually rose with extraordinary talent and gradually became the most powerful existence in the runic world. It gradually grasped the entire runic world, causing the development of the runic world to become faster and faster. In just a short while, the entire rune world had become an extremely perfect and wonderful world that wasn't much different from any of the great 1,000 realms. Such a scene would only make the venerables sigh in amazement at the wonders of the rune world. They would never have guessed the root cause of this transformation. It was because the consciousness born from the divinatory disk had entered it. It had participated in the evolution of the rune world and gradually made the rune world evolve in a direction that was most beneficial to it. After the divinatory disk's essence had transformed, its ability to withstand the attacks of the array formation had increased. It had strengthened to an unbelievable level. With such an ability, the divinatory disk didn't waver or show any signs of instability despite the increasingly powerful attacks from the surrounding array formation. In fact, it seemed to be even more relaxed than when it had first entered the array formation. This was because the divinatory disk's ability to withstand had increased by an unknown amount. Hence, the runes that represented the mysteries of the array formation that it deduced became continuous and showed no signs of stopping. Almost endless runes were continuously thrown into the rune world and continuously made the rune world stronger and stronger. The foundation of the rune world was constructed by the runes that carried the mysteries of the array formation. The mysteries of the rune world were naturally contained within it. Naturally, it contained a great deal of the formation's secrets, as well as a great deal of the principles contained in the formation. That way, when the Supreme Venerable Ones comprehended the world of runes, it was equivalent to comprehending the formation's mystery. He could feel his own understanding of the great Tao at almost every moment. His understanding of the way of the sage was also deepening. Almost everyone had vaguely found the direction of their next cultivation step in this process. He vaguely found another path to break through to the sage realm in front of him. To a Supreme Venerable One, no treasure could compare with such a gain. Therefore, at this moment, the Supreme Experts had already unknowingly forgotten their original goal. Instead, they focused all their attention on the runic world, trying their best to comprehend all the mysteries, all the principles, and all the secrets in that world. During this process, time gradually passed. That runic world became more and more vast and powerful. In the end, it brazenly broke through the level of an ordinary great thousand world and directly broke into the level of their world, the demon realm, and the central main world. It had reached the level where it could give birth to the sage that they knew, which was also the level of a false sage. However, compared to the world that was derived from the mysteries of the sage's divine ability, this formation was clearly inferior in nature. Although it had reached that level and reached the level where it could give birth to a sage, it was still a long way from truly giving birth to a sage. Billions of trillions of years had passed in the runic world, and the world had even been destroyed and reborn hundreds of times. However, no sage had been born in that world. The strongest existence in the entire world was at the level of a supreme venerable, which was equivalent to the level of the hundreds of people who were comprehending the world of runes at this moment. If Luo Fan had seen this change, he would naturally be extremely dissatisfied. However, to the supreme venerable ones, they were almost completely immersed in it. Luo Fan had once seen a world that was derived from the mysteries of the divine ability that could give birth to a sage. Naturally, he could see the flaws in this runic world at a glance. However, these supreme venerable ones did not have such conditions. In fact, it was their first time seeing a world derived from the mysteries of the divine ability. The fact that existences like supreme venerable ones could be derived was beyond their imagination, and it was enough to make them exclaim about the wonders of creation. They admired the person who set up the formation so much that they could not even think about going against it. How could they still fantasize that a sage could be born in that world? Even if the world of runes kept being destroyed and reborn, its essence would not change at all. They were still derived from the mysteries of the formation, and they contained many of the formation's mysteries. Therefore, even if the world was destroyed and reborn hundreds of times, none of the supreme venerable ones felt bored and realized that they could not gain anything from it. Therefore, their performance was naturally not much different from how it was at the beginning. The supreme venerable ones were naturally delighted and satisfied with the process of gaining something at every moment. Apart from the mad venerable, a supreme venerable who had cut off his senses to the outside world from the start and had even lost control of his body, several years passed unknowingly. The mysteries contained in the formation were clearly beyond the imagination of the supreme venerable ones. Even though it was being analyzed at all times, and even though some mysteries left the formation and entered the rune world at all times, the process did not look like it was going to end after several years. An attack emerged from the formation. It was still continuous, without any signs of stopping. As for the runes that were born from the 8 trigram plate, none of them were the same as before. They surged into the runic world and continuously made the runic world evolve towards a higher level. The runic world became increasingly vast, and the laws and laws within it became increasingly complicated and tighter. It also gave the cultivators within more and more space to cultivate. This was because there was a limit to the rune world. Therefore, every time it reached its limit, the runic world would be destroyed, and then a new one would be born from the ruins. He was growing again. The process of the runic world's development was recreated. And now, it was time to step into the process of destruction. The entire runic world was already showing the aura before the end of the world. Countless powerful women had used their own methods to predict the impending destruction of the runic world. They had used their own methods to predict the impending destruction of the runic world. All of them were making preparations for the destruction of the world in their own ways. Among them, Yi Qingyu among them, there were all sorts of struggles. There were all sorts of ugliness, cruelty, and ruthlessness. The supreme venerable ones who were watching from the outside had a stern expression on their faces. This was because they realized that if they were to fall into the same state as them, their performance would probably be similar to theirs. This understanding made them involuntarily make an inexplicable connection. Is there someone outside looking at them with the same gaze now? Such thoughts were naturally fruitless. The Supreme Venerable Ones were not ordinary people, so they naturally would not dwell on such thoughts for a long time. Very soon, they tossed these thoughts to the back of their heads and focused on comprehending the mysteries of the runic world. Time passed slowly. Finally, it was the time when the runic world was about to be destroyed. Just as everyone thought that the process that had evolved hundreds of times was about to reappear in front of them, a change that exceeded their expectations, or rather, they should have thought of it but had unknowingly overlooked it, happened suddenly. An extremely ordinary-looking palm reached out from the formation. It seemed to be moving slowly, but it was actually moving very quickly. The hand gently grabbed the divinatory plate, and with a slight shake, everyone realized that their holy wills had left the divinatory plate, but they did not return to their bodies. Instead, they shot out in all directions, shooting out to all corners of the world. Sensing this change, the Supreme Venerable Ones did not have the mood to care about what was happening to the divinatory plate. They all shouted in shock and anger, then quickly chased after their holy wills. Compared to their holy wills, everything else was just an external object, it was all secondary. Now that the holy wills actually had the possibility of leaving their control and being taken by other living beings, how could they still have the mood to care about anything else? The holy wills shot out at an unparalleled speed, disappearing hundreds of millions of miles away in a flash. The Supreme Venerables who chased after the holy wills had naturally disappeared hundreds of millions of miles away in a flash, in the blink of an eye. Only the crazy Venerable was left in this place. He was struggling to recover from the state of his mind being shrouded by hundreds of holy wills. The palm grabbed the divinatory plate and shook it. After getting rid of all the foreign holy wills, it shrank and disappeared without a trace. "Little fella, aren't you coming out yet?" Soon after, a chuckle came from the formation. Although the voice was soft, its penetrative ability was unimaginably powerful. It poured directly into the runic world and rang clearly in the ears of the Supreme Venerable. The Supreme Venerable could not help but be horrified when he heard the voice. "You're not talking to me, are you?" he mumbled. He actually wanted to pretend that he did not hear the voice and continue with what he was doing to prepare for the impending destruction of the runic world. At this moment, an unimaginable force suddenly descended from the sky. The entire runic world shook and instantly split into countless runes, which suddenly condensed into the figure of a divinatory plate in the void. The Supreme Venerable directly left the runic world and appeared in an extremely vast and mighty formation. Beneath his feet, there was a divination plate that was almost the same as the one formed by runes above him. When he lowered his head to look at his body, he realized that he did not know when. His body no longer looked like the Supreme Venerable from before. Instead, he looked like a 5- or 6-year-old child. All of a sudden, he recalled a memory from billions of years ago. He sighed and sank into the divinatory plate below him. At this moment, the divinatory plate that was formed by runes also sank into the divinatory plate. The divinatory plate, the child, and the runes suddenly emitted an extremely unique light. The light could not be described with any color. It seemed to contain all the colors in the universe. It also seemed to have no color at all. After the light shone through, it penetrated the void and illuminated the entire space-time that spanned billions of light years. It penetrated the billions of large, medium-sized, and small worlds hidden in this space-time. All the secrets and profundities within them. In an instant they were completely plundered. At this moment, an ordinary-looking man walked out from the depths of the formation. He slowly walked to the side of the divinatory plate and casually picked it up. The divinatory plate instantly fell into his hand. All the light on it disappeared in an instant. The entire divinatory plate looked like it was made of some unknown material. It looked like an ordinary tool in the hands of that swindler. This man was none other than Luo Fan. "Little fellow, what are you waiting for if you don't come out?" Luo Fan looked at the supreme treasure in his hands and said with a smile. As he spoke, he raised his hand and threw the divinatory plate forward. The divinatory plate rotated in the air and turned into a child. He had a bitter expression on his face as he bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Divine divination boy greets master. You don't have to be so unwilling. Now that you have spiritual wisdom, if you were to return to the hands of your original owner, you would definitely be erased. Only in my hands can you maintain your current spiritual wisdom," Luo Fan said with a smile. The child thought for a moment and understood that what Luo Fan said was the truth. His worry turned to joy as he said again, "Thank you, Master, for saving my life. So, the one with the power of a sage isn't the boulder, but you." At this moment, the Mad Lord's voice entered Luo Fan's ears. Luo Fan turned around and did not answer his probing question. He smiled and said, "You must be the Mad Lord. Thank you for your treasure." This made the Mad Lord's face twitch. The magic treasure that Luo Fan was talking about was his natal magic treasure. It was the treasure that he relied on for cultivation. He suppressed his desire to attack and said, "I'm afraid it's not appropriate for you to take someone else's life treasure and end their cultivation future, right?" After all, he was not a real lunatic. He clearly felt that the person before him was many times stronger than him and could even crush him with one hand. How could he overestimate himself and use the most violent method to resist? Luo Fan laughed and said, "It's not appropriate for me to take your life treasure? Then what about you stopping someone from achieving the Tao?" Stopping someone from achieving the Tao? The Mad Lord's face twitched. Stopping someone from achieving the Tao was a heavy sentence. To a cultivator, there were two types of hatred that could not be reconciled. That was, the vengeance of killing someone and obstructing them from achieving the Tao. Killing someone was needless to say. How could such hatred be reconciled when even one's life was taken? Stopping someone from achieving the Tao did not seem as serious as killing someone, but to a cultivator, it was a deeper hatred than killing someone. Although killing someone was deep, if one could still talk about it, it meant that the other party had not succeeded in killing someone. Only then could one talk about killing someone. However, stopping someone from achieving the Tao was different. For a cultivator to have one opportunity to achieve the Tao in countless years was already a great opportunity. If one missed it, they would never have another chance to achieve the Tao. Thus, stopping someone from achieving the Tao was equivalent to cutting off the possibility of achieving the Tao. His path of cultivation had almost sunk into the darkness of despair, and his billions of years of bitter cultivation had gone up in smoke. How could such hatred be compared to killing someone who had not succeeded in killing someone? Isn't your accusation too heavy? I only broke this formation. How is that stopping someone from achieving the Tao? The Mad Lord knew the severity of the matter and quickly said. Luo Fan looked at him with a faint smile and said, "Is this word game very interesting?" The Mad Lord opened his mouth, but could not say anything. Luo Fan glanced at him and felt regretful. If the Mad Lord dared to quibble at this moment, he would have dared to wipe him out right now. But it was a pity that the Mad Lord knew the timing and stopped at this moment. At this moment, the formation that Luo Fan had set up began to produce an extremely strong fluctuation. Feeling this fluctuation, a complicated look appeared in Luo Fan's eyes. He sighed and raised his hand. The array instantly collapsed, revealing the cave mansion that was originally enveloped by the array. In other words, it was a vast and boundless starry sky world. At this very moment, in that world, an indescribable fluctuation was constantly being emitted. This fluctuation was extremely mysterious. It seemed like an ordinary fluctuation, but it also seemed to contain all the mysteries of the universe. In an extremely absolute manner, it spread towards the endless space-time in this world. It enveloped the entire world in this mysterious fluctuation. This fluctuation seemed extremely mysterious at first. However, as time passed, the fluctuation gradually gained a special quality that normal cultivators could not have. A special quality that could not be worn down by tens of thousands of tribulations gradually appeared in the fluctuation. A special quality that was eternal and indestructible gradually appeared in the fluctuation. The moment this special quality appeared in the fluctuation, countless heavenly flowers suddenly condensed out of thin air and began to slowly fall from the sky. Then, endless rays of light shrouded the entire world, filling up the boundless great thousand realms, medium thousand realms, minor thousand realms, and even other ordinary spacetime that had not reached the level of minor thousand realms. Soon after, an extremely melodious voice that could not be distinguished at all filled the entire world like the rays of light, filling up the endless worlds. This is attaining Tao and becoming a sage? The Mad Lord's eyes revealed a look of disbelief at this moment. He stood there blankly. There seemed to be countless thoughts surging in his mind, but it also seemed like it had turned into a complete blank. Attaining Tao and becoming a sage was the most fundamental pursuit of every cultivator, especially for those who had cultivated to the utmost venerable realm. In fact, they had even attempted this direction several times. It was unknown how many times they had fantasized about finally taking that step and attaining Tao successfully. However, under such circumstances, they realized that someone had actually achieved the breakthrough that they had dreamed of in front of their eyes. The complexity of their feelings was indescribable. At this moment, although the utmost venerables who had discovered this change had different reactions, their core thoughts were no different from the Mad Lord's. Their feelings were also unimaginably complicated. At this moment, the cave abode that Luo Fan had opened up suddenly collapsed. A figure, accompanied by boundless rays of light, heavenly flowers, and Tao sounds that seemed to be cheering for the world, slowly walked out from the fragments of the world. With every step he took, the eternal and indestructible charm he exuded would increase by a fold. With every step he took, a part of his body transformed into a state that Luo Fan could not understand. With every step he took, the strange phenomenon that lingered around his body doubled in intensity. With every step he took, his figure doubled in size. Just like that, he walked step by step towards the boundless sky, towards the goal that would require him to take at least tens of millions, or even hundreds of millions of steps. At this moment, the entire world seemed to have frozen. No matter where they were, no matter what strength they had, the eyes of every living being reflected the figure walking towards the sky. This figure's walking speed was the same as an ordinary person's walking speed. It was extremely slow. According to calculations, if he were to walk step by step from the ground to the sky and continuously take tens of millions, or even hundreds of millions of steps, it would probably take hundreds or even thousands of years for him to reach his goal. Countless living beings would not be able to watch such a process forever. Whether it was lifespan or patience, an ordinary person would not be able to watch someone walk for hundreds or thousands of years. Chapter 1481. The person who was proving his Tao and becoming a saint was naturally the Taoist rock. Watermark advertisement test. Watermark advertisement test. Previously, when the Mad Lord and the others were struggling against the formation that Luo Fan had set up, trying to find a way to break through it and find the treasures within it, Luo Fan had already recited the great Tao sounds that the Taoist rock had recited when he was still a saint to the Taoist rock in the cave abode within the formation. The Taoist rock himself did not fully understand the great Tao sound. He was neither a false saint nor a true saint, so how could he fully understand the true profoundness of the great Tao sounds? However, not being able to understand it did not mean that he could not recite it. After all, the great Tao sounds appeared in his heart. After all, the Taoist rock had recited them in his heart in the past. The great Tao sounds had always been in his heart, and he had not forgotten them at all. This way, the requirement for him to recite the great Tao sounds had nothing to do with his ability to understand them. Instead, it was related to the state of his body. As long as his voice was strong enough to recite the great Tao sounds, he would naturally be able to recite them. The great Tao sounds were recited by the Taoist rock in the past. To the Taoist rock, they were naturally completely different from others. It was countless times easier for the Taoist rock to understand the great Tao sounds compared to ordinary cultivators. In fact, it was much easier for him to understand the great Tao sounds compared to Luo Fan back then. Therefore, while Luo Fan was reciting the great Tao sounds, the Taoist rock quickly grasped the profoundness of the saint's divine ability. As the great Tao sounds continued for a longer time, his understanding of the divine ability continued to break through. In the end, it also caused his cultivation to break through continuously. He broke through barriers one after another, allowing him to surpass the level 9, false saint, surpassing the venerable realm, and enter the realm of the Saint Tao. He regained what he had lost. He regained the status of a false saint. During this period of time, however, it was only 1,000 years. That's right, 1,000 years. Although he was looking at it from outside the cave. This formation had not been around for a long time, but in the cave dwelling, in the world that Luo Fan had created, over 1,000 years had passed. Manipulating time. This was a piece of cake for Luo Fan. This was especially true in the world he had created. Originally, because time no longer had much meaning to him, he rarely used this method of controlling time and speeding up the flow of time to cultivate. But the situation this time was different. This time, he and the Taoist boulder were in a world with a saint. Moreover, what they had planned was, or to prove the Tao and become a saint. For such a big matter, even the slightest negligence could lead to eternal damnation. And the longer it lasted, the more likely it was for new problems to arise, and the more likely it was for accidents to occur, and the more likely it was for negligence. But this was a fact that was universally accepted. Therefore, in order to reduce the possibility of accidents, he could only speed up the flow of time in the cave dwelling and shorten the process of the Taoist boulder becoming a saint to an acceptable range. If it was not for the fact that he had to preach the Tao voice, maintain the formation, and be wary of the changes outside, he could have sped up the flow of time even more. If that was the case, he might have already completed his task a long time ago. As he stood quietly in the air and looked up at the Taoist boulder, who was walking step by step in the air, Luo Fan's emotions were rather complicated. Becoming a false sage was an incredible method to strengthen oneself, but at the same time, such a choice also tied the cultivator to a certain world. Although it was not impossible for one to become a true saint, it was a huge obstacle to the process. Luo Fan was naturally very clear about this. However, this did not mean that he would not be moved when he saw others becoming saints. Looking at someone who was originally about the same as him, or even much weaker than him, using some things he had given him to prove his Tao and become a saint, obtaining power that was millions and millions of times stronger than his own, Luo Fan's heart was, of course, inevitably complicated. He watched as the Taoist boulder's figure became more and more ethereal, and the light in his eyes became more and more intelligent and transcendent. He felt that the image of the Taoist boulder was gradually merging with the image of the saint in his heart. He suddenly knew that the Taoist boulder that he had been with for thousands of years would no longer exist from now on. All that was left was the Taoist boulder. The Taoist boulder seemed to be walking towards the sky, but he was actually walking towards an unfathomable place. It was a place that was similar to the chaotic state in the golden core of the world. In other words, he was going to the residence of the saint. If Luo Fan was in a world where he could obtain supreme authority, he would naturally be able to clearly sense the location of that strange state, and he could even enter it easily. However, in this world, his seal of authority had not absorbed the authority of this world yet, so it was impossible for him to obtain supreme authority. Therefore, to him, that place did not exist at all. It was impossible for him to sense its existence, let alone step into it. In this way, in his eyes, the Taoist boulder was slowly walking towards the sky just like everyone else. He was also slowly becoming unimaginable, illusory, and invisible. This process was not fast, and it lasted for over 1,000 years. However, to the living beings in the countless major worlds, medium worlds, and small worlds, this period of time was like the blink of an eye. No one felt that they had been standing in a daze for such a long time. In fact, almost all the living beings only felt that it was not enough. They only felt that the time was so short that they could not even see the saint's face clearly, and they could not truly feel how powerful the saint was. Only the powerful cultivators could feel that the time of this world had been distorted by some unimaginable power during this period of time. They could feel how terrifying and powerful the saint's godly might was. Luo Fan was naturally one of them. He only came to a realization after everything was over. Although 1,000 years had passed in this world just now, it had only been a short while for the outside world. But to the outside world, only a short while had passed. He distorted the time of this world just to display the profoundness of the saint. Luo Fan could not help but think. At this moment, the Mad Lord suddenly reacted. He turned around and turned into a ray of light, disappearing in front of Luo Fan. There was a benefit to being a supreme venerable who was famous for being crazy. He did not have to care about his identity at all, and he could escape and leave as he pleased. After all, he was a madman, wasn't he? Luo Fan watched the Mad Lord flee like a stray dog, and only shook his head. He did not care about him, nor did he have the intention to teach him a lesson for trying to break his formation back then. He was not stingy to such an extent. Let's go. After the Mad Lord left, Luo Fan turned around and said to the Divine Divination Boy. The Divine Divination Boy was extremely nervous beside the Mad Lord. He was extremely terrified, as if the psychological trauma that had existed for billions of years prevented him from facing the Mad Lord normally. Now that the Mad Lord did not even dare to say a word and immediately turned to leave, he suddenly heaved a sigh of relief, and his rejection towards Luo Fan suddenly decreased by a lot. After hearing Luo Fan's words, he nodded and said, "Yes, Master." Luo Fan smiled and waved his hand. The Divine Divination Boy turned into an extremely ordinary divination plate and fell into Luo Fan's heaven and earth sleeve. After keeping the divination plate, Luo Fan turned around and was about to leave this world. At this moment, Bian suddenly felt something in his heaven and earth sleeve tremble, leaving his heaven and earth sleeve and appearing in the void in front of him. This item was none other than the Seal of Authority. Although this Seal of Authority had become full in the Sacred Venerable's world because the Sacred Venerable had injected the corresponding authority into it. However, that authority had already been used up when he obtained the supreme authority in that world. Therefore, the Seal of Authority that appeared in front of him was extremely dim and obviously empty. When he saw the Seal of Authority suddenly appear, Luo Fan was stunned at first. Then, he suddenly smiled faintly. He knew what was going on. At this moment, the entire world shook slightly, and a boundless phenomenon appeared. An invisible and intangible existence was emitted from the great path of the world, from the laws of the world, from the space-time of the world, and from everything in the world. It crossed the layers of barriers and continuously poured into the Seal of Authority. As the creator and refiner of the Seal of Authority, Luo Fan instantly knew what was pouring into the Seal of Authority. It was authority. It was the authority of this world. As the authority poured in, the Seal of Authority gradually dimmed, and the entire Seal of Authority became brighter and more dazzling. In the end, it seemed to have become a sun, emitting a strange aura that seemed sacred yet not sacred. It enveloped the entire world, and even broke through the boundless major 1,000 realms, medium 1,000 realms, and minor 1,000 realms. Unknowingly, The seal of authority was like another sun in these realms. It emitted endless light and heat, and its existence was reflected in the boundless worlds of this world. At this moment, almost all the cultivators who sensed the light emitted by the seal of authority felt an indescribable greed in their hearts. All the cultivators instinctively knew that if they obtained this item, they would become the most honorable existence in this world. Their status might not even be lower than a sage's. However, before even the fastest and quickest cultivator could make a move, the light from the seal of authority instantly disappeared. Then, the entire seal of authority disappeared without a trace. The one who put away the seal of authority was obviously Luo Fan. At this moment, he casually pressed his hand down, and the seal of authority entered his body. When the seal of authority truly calmed down in his body, he suddenly felt that he was completely different. At the very least, in this world, he had become completely different from before. The feeling of supreme authority in the world that he had created, and even in the world that the sacred venerable had created in the golden elixir, reappeared in his heart at this moment. This wonderful feeling of omnipotence, omniscience, and omniscience. He could not help but let out a long breath. "I'm finally back," he thought to himself. When this thought flashed through his mind, he suddenly smiled bitterly. It turned out that he did not know when it had started. He had actually gotten used to this feeling of omniscience, omniscience, and omnipotence. In comparison, it was a normal feeling that he had when he did not receive any blessing. On the contrary, he was no longer used to it. With a bitter smile, he turned his gaze to the sky. He looked at a place that he could not see or feel before, but at this moment, it was so clear and intuitive. It was a strange, gray, and chaotic state. There, he saw 19 extremely ordinary-looking people. Faintly, it seemed to contain the most profound figure in the universe. In an instant, he understood. These were the 19 sages that currently existed in this world. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. With a flash of his figure, he had already crossed the layers of empty space. The barrier appeared in that strange state not far away from the 19 sages. Once again stepping into the layers of state, an indescribable comfort and contentment came out of nowhere. He could not help but take a deep breath. Just as he was now more used to omniscience, omniscience, and omnipotence, he was now more used to this strange state that was close to the state of chaos. As for the normal world, he felt that there was a layer of separation. Feeling that inexplicable contentment, Luo Fan bowed to the 19 sages and said, "I am Luo Fan. Greetings, sages." These 19 sages did not seem to have anything special about them. None of them had any strange appearances. Every one of them looked like an ordinary cultivator. Just like a cultivator. Among them, there were men and women, old and young. If one were to point out the difference between them and ordinary cultivators, it would be that each of them had an unimaginable divine light of wisdom in their eyes. It was the kind of profound wisdom that seemed to have seen through all the mysteries of the Great Path, as well as all the secrets of cultivation and the principles of cultivation. Even the most powerful Supreme Venerable would not have such wisdom. There was no other reason. A Supreme Venerable was a Supreme Venerable. No matter how powerful a Supreme Venerable was, he was still a Supreme Venerable. Since they were Supreme Venerables, they were actually failures that had failed to break through to the sage realm. For failures like them, no matter how profound their wisdom was, there would definitely be some doubt and confusion in the depths of their eyes. They were confused about how to become a sage, and they were confused about the path of becoming a sage that was shrouded in fog. This doubt and confusion was enough to cause the profound wisdom in their eyes to fall to a lower level. They would never be able to compare to the wisdom in the eyes of the sages. Among the 19 sages, 18 of them looked at Luo Fan with indifferent and wise eyes. At most, they only nodded slightly as a response to Luo Fan. Only the bolder saint smiled and said to Luo Fan, "There's no need to be so courteous. You've helped me achieve my path, so you're my benefactor. I hope you can address me as you used to. Luo Fan smiled faintly and did not reply. After becoming a sage, not only did the Taoist boulder's identity change, but even his nature had undergone a subtle change. Strictly speaking, he was no longer the same person as the Taoist boulder from before. Seeing Luo Fan's reaction, the boulder saint sighed. He knew what Luo Fan meant, so he did not mention anything about addressing him. He only smiled and said, "Now that you've obtained the authority granted by me and the other sages, how much of your strength have you recovered?" Hearing that, Luo Fan said thoughtfully, "Looks like there's a reason why the other sages agreed to help me fill up my seal of authority." What kind of existence was Luo Fan? It went without saying that he was very rational. In fact, when the seal of authority was being filled up, he had already guessed that it must have been the Boulder Saint's doing. In this world, only the Boulder Saint had the motive to do such a thing. Although it was the Boulder Saint's doing, as one of the 19 sages in this world, the Boulder Saint wanted to give the supreme authority of this world to someone. However, he definitely could not bypass the other 18 sages. Even if one of the 18 sages disagreed with this matter, even if one of them interfered with the process, it would be impossible for the authority to be injected into the wisdom of the seal of authority so smoothly. It would be impossible for Luo Fan to have such supreme authority in this world at this time. Therefore, it was very obvious. It was the joint decision of the 19 sages that he was able to obtain this supreme authority. If it was just the Taoist boulder's decision, it could be said that the Taoist boulder felt that Luo Fan had helped him become a sage, so he had specially given this authority to thank Luo Fan. However, if it was the joint decision of the 19 sages, it would be impossible. How could the other 18 sages pay for the kindness of the 19th sage? However, how could the other 18 sages pay for the kindness of the 19th sage? As expected, I can't hide it from you, fellow Taoist. The Boulder Saint smiled faintly. Luo Fan looked at the Boulder Saint and sighed inwardly. The current Boulder Saint was indeed different from the Taoist boulder from before. If it was the Taoist boulder from before, he would definitely be smiling now. However, although the monolithic rock saint in front of Luo Fan was joking, there was still a bit of indifference in his eyes that were filled with incomparable wisdom. This kind of apathy was supreme, eternal and inextinguishable. This was the true attitude of the sages towards all living beings that had not become sages. It was also the true attitude of the Boulder Saint towards Luo Fan. After realizing this, Luo Fan suddenly felt a little dispirited. He said indifferently, "I don't care what plans you have or what thoughts you have. However, if it doesn't benefit me at all, there's no need to say any more." Hearing this, a middle-aged sage at the side finally spoke. "A mere false sage dares to look down on us with just this bit of supreme authority? Looks like you won't be able to wake up if you don't recognize your own strength. May I ask how I should address you, sage?" Luo Fan asked nonchalantly. Although the sage's words were not polite, his gaze towards Luo Fan did not change at all. It was still as calm, indifferent, and wise as ever. It felt like he was talking to a dead object. This is the sage Zhan Hui, the 6th senior to become a sage. The person who answered Luo Fan's question was not the middle-aged sage, but the Boulder Saint. So it's the sage Zhan Hui. No wonder. Luo Fan smiled. By saying no wonder, he was naturally referring to the fact that the sage Zhan Hui was famous for fighting. No wonder he was so eager to make a move. All the sages present naturally knew what he meant. However, no one present had any change in expression because of that. Even Saint Zhan Hui, who was targeted by those words, remained the same. It was not that they were broad-minded and did not care about such words at all. Instead, they did not care that the words came from Luo Fan's mouth. It was like an adult speaking to a baby. Would one really be angry that a baby was scolding them? Luo Fan had expected their attitude, so he did not feel humiliated at all. He merely smiled. Since the sage Zhan Hui wants me to understand my own strength, then please make your move. The sage Zhan Hui looked at Luo Fan, and the indifference in his eyes became even more obvious. He slowly reached out his palm towards Luo Fan. At first glance, the palm seemed so ordinary and ordinary. It was as if an ordinary person who had cultivated martial arts for a few days would be able to use a palm that was more exquisite than this. However, Luo Fan could tell that the palm contained endless profoundness. It contained the profoundness that could almost form an independent path. Under the palm, he faintly felt as if his connection with the entire world had been completely cut off. In fact, he even vaguely felt as if his body's power was being suppressed by an unbelievably powerful force. It made him feel as if he had become an ordinary person and was facing a huge palm that covered the sky and earth, looming over him from the sky. This was a typical attack from a fake sage. Chapter 1482. Such a method might be a desperate situation for a cultivator who had just grasped the supreme authority of a part of the world, but for an experienced existence like Luo Fan, it was really not difficult at all. With a jolt of his heart, he also raised his hand and welcomed the palm that Saint Zhan Hui had extended out. The palm also seemed extremely ordinary, but it was also extremely profound. It contained the profoundness that only sages could understand. In other words, the palm contained the profoundness of a sage's Tao. The bolder saint did not find it strange when he saw Luo Fan unleashing such a palm, but the other 18 sages could no longer remain calm. Their indifferent and intelligent eyes were filled with astonishment. In particular, Saint Zhan Hui was able to sense the might of Luo Fan's palm more directly than the other sages, as he had personally welcomed Luo Fan's palm. The instant Luo Fan made his move, he could clearly sense that Luo Fan's palm contained a sage's Tao that was on par with his comprehension. The principles contained within were so profound that it made him feel as if the person in front of him was a supreme, eternal, and invincible saint like him. "No wonder you're so confident," Saint Zhan Hui said plainly. As he spoke, his palm had already come into contact with Luo Fan's palm. The instant they came into contact, the extremely obscure power that the two palms contained was finally unleashed. A power that could not be sensed or even seen by non-sages was finally unleashed. In that instant a boundless, pure, destructive power burst out. It began to sweep in all directions. The destructive power was incredibly pure and powerful. Even the strange state that was unbearable for supreme venerable ones in the surroundings could not withstand it, and it crumbled right away. In the blink of an eye, everything and any power. In a void that did not exist, there were no laws or laws. It appeared around the place where their palms came into contact. In that instant, almost every living being and every cultivator in this part of the world began to tremble. In an instant, a strange scene appeared in the sky. There were two incomparably huge beasts. It was as if a palm that filled the entire world had appeared in midair. Suddenly, they came into contact with each other. Around the palm, a huge hole seemed to have been torn open in the world. Although there was no light or shadow, there were no fluctuations, but everyone could faintly feel that there was an incomparably terrifying destructive power within. An indescribable fear naturally formed in their hearts. All the living beings here instantly felt as if the end of the world was coming. The place where Luo Fan and Saint Zhan Hui's palms collided was where the saint resided. It was a strange, murky, chaotic state. However, the location of this strange state was actually not somewhere in this world. In fact, it was not even in a fixed location. Instead, it seemed to cover every corner of the world, and it might even envelop the entire world. At the very least, that was the case in this world. The reason why it could not be seen by living beings or sensed by cultivators was because this state had surpassed the senses of ordinary cultivators. This was because this state contained a mystery that far surpassed the understanding of the most powerful venerables. However, the current situation was that a part of this strange state had been destroyed by the palms of Luo Fan and Saint Jean Hui. This clearly resulted in a result. That was, the destroyed portion had broken away from its original strange state. Although it was everywhere, it could not be sensed or seen by any being. Therefore, it would truly appear in this world, and be seen by all the living beings in this world. That was why the current scene was created. Luo Fan and Saint Jean Hui's palm strike had actually appeared in the boundless world, causing it to appear everywhere. All the living beings felt a great sense of fear. If there wasn't any other power to stop it, the impact wouldn't have stopped at this point. It would have continued to destroy and continue to completely destroy the dusky and bizarre state around it. However, it was clear that this would not happen at the moment. There were still 18 saints in the surroundings. How could they watch as their place of cultivation was destroyed so easily? Therefore, they did not do anything at this moment, but the gray and strange state changed naturally. Various unknown powers were born, and the impact caused by the palms of Luo Fan and Saint Jean Hui was instantly eliminated. What's more, this bizarre power even reversed the situation and restored the destroyed region. In the blink of an eye, the region that was destroyed had been completely restored, as though nothing had happened. After the change, all the living beings in the countless worlds instantly realized that the palms in the sky had completely disappeared. The fear that felt like the end of the world had also completely disappeared in an instant. However, although the scene had disappeared, the feeling that was left in the hearts of the living beings would not disappear. All the living beings were trembling in fear, and most of the ordinary people were kowtowing to the sky. The foolish ones were praying for the heavens to protect them. However, the smarter ones who knew more about the truth of the world directly begged the saints to protect them. Although Luo Fan's ability to resist had already proved that he could launch a saint-level attack, however, if he wanted to truly test his strength, this palm strike alone was clearly not enough. Whether it was Saint Jean Hui or the other sages, they all knew this very well. Even Luo Fan understood this rather well. Therefore, Saint Jean Hui's next move did not surprise the other saints or Luo Fan. Saint Jean Hui raised his hand and pointed, and a strange light instantly rushed out from his finger. This ray of light was extremely condensed, extremely pure, and extremely mysterious. After it appeared, it seemed to be eternally unmoving, eternally unchanging. It had a stability that was beyond anyone's imagination. However, upon closer inspection, one would suddenly realize that it seemed like all the mysteries of the universe could be found within it. It seemed to be evolving endlessly at every moment, displaying all the mysteries of the great Tao. After the light appeared, it naturally stirred up the surrounding strange state. It broke the original state of the strange state. It was unknown how many billions of worlds appeared and revolved around this light. It looked like the halo brought about by this light. And looking at the various appearances of those worlds, however, it was clearly the manifestation of all the mysteries contained within the light. In other words, they were naturally affected by the light. Even the way the world evolved was naturally changed, changing the original direction of evolution into the various directions contained in the spiritual light. The power to break the strange state was extremely strong, and the damage to the strange state was also extremely strong. In an instant, this beam of light and the world around it were projected into the entire world, into the countless major worlds, medium worlds, and minor worlds. It made all living beings once again feel the fear that had just descended, the fear of the end of the world coming to the living beings in that world, even the most powerful venerables. They could not understand the essence of this change. They did not know that all of this was caused by the light. To them, what they saw was billions of worlds pushing against each other, constantly rushing towards the world they were in. Billions of worlds were about to collide with their world and be destroyed along with theirs, heading towards extinction at the same time. To the living beings, this kind of world-level disaster could only make them feel shocked and terrified, but they could not summon any thoughts of resistance. Could it really be the end of the world? Some cultivators who were originally extremely determined that the world would not be destroyed could not help but think to themselves. Compared to ordinary living beings, cultivators knew far more things. To them, the existence of saints was not a secret. Ordinary living beings might have thought that the various scenes that happened before the world was about to be destroyed, but they knew very well that it was not a phenomenon, but a fight between saints. Because they knew this, they were not too afraid when the palm appeared for the first time, even though they were worried. They did not think that the end of the world was really coming. After all, a fight between saints was more likely to be a spar, and they would not really sit by and watch the world be destroyed. However, they could no longer be so determined now. At this moment, the terrifying power and the attack that carried the power of the endless worlds were too exaggerated no matter how they looked at it. They could not help but wonder if the saints were really going all out and did not care about anything anymore. Thinking of this, the fear of the end of the world caused their expressions to change. Saints were omnipotent. If they were really going all out, no matter how vast and powerful the world was, it would not be able to stop them. It was also impossible to block it. If they made a wrong move, they might completely destroy the endless worlds in this world. When these cultivators began to panic, the fear of the end of the world could no longer be suppressed. At that moment, the worlds began to become chaotic. Before the end of the world, the nature of all living beings began to be magnified endlessly. The ugliness and the kindness were all revealed without reservation. Countless powerful beings who were originally sanctimonious and revered by people revealed their hidden ugly faces. Countless beings who were originally rejected and condemned as evil were also revealed their good nature. It made people feel at a loss, and in the end, it added to the chaos in these worlds. For many saints, all the changes in this world were naturally reflected in their hearts. However, they did not care about these changes. None of them took it to heart. To them, all living beings were so insignificant. They could easily create billions of them. Under such circumstances, no matter how chaotic the living beings were, as long as the world itself was not destroyed, it was just a small matter to them. As for Luo Fan, although he was not a saint, he did not have the indifference of a saint. However, he was not benevolent to the point where he had no principles. Although this kind of chaos was surging, it had a lot to do with him. However, he did not even care about the other saints who could stop these changes with a raise of their hand. How could he meddle in other people's business? Besides, the chaos in this world was actually just a manifestation of the nature of all living beings, even though it seemed cruel. It seemed chaotic. However, in Luo Fan's eyes it seemed more real. In comparison, compared to before, it was a different scene. Because of this, Luo Fan was very clear about all the changes in this world. However, he did not care about it at all. At this moment, all his attention was focused on the ray of light that Saint Jean Hui had released. The power of this ray of light was extremely powerful. Although it was not a pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasure, its power was many times stronger than the palm that Saint Jean Hui had released. If he used the previous method to deal with this ray of light, even if he had the supreme authority of this world, he would definitely be completely evaporated by this ray of light. All traces of his existence would be completely erased. After realizing this, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed, and a ray of light surged out of his hand. This ray of light was not the same as the light that Saint Jean Hui had released, but another kind of light. It was the light that he had seen from the saint in the world that the saint had opened up. It was an extremely pure light of destruction that rejected all other existences, the light of extinction. As soon as the light appeared, it naturally destroyed the surrounding gray existences, revealing its image in the sky of all the worlds in this world. It charged towards the ray of light that Saint Jean Hui had released. In the eyes of all living beings, This scene was like a strange ray of light suddenly appearing in the sky and blasting towards the countless worlds that were constantly pushing towards their world. To living beings who could not see through the nature of things, there was only one conclusion that could be drawn from this scene. That was, the countless worlds wanted to destroy their world, and this ray of light was emitted by some existence to block these worlds. In other words, the light was saving them. In the strange gray state, the two rays of light appeared almost at the same time, but what they saw in the countless worlds was not the same. The strange state was a state where even time had become chaotic. When everything happened, it was naturally chaotic in the eyes of the outside world. For example, the time when the two palms met was even shorter than when Luo Fan and Saint Jean Hui's palms met. And now, the speed at which the light appeared was much slower than the actual time. At the very least, from the appearance of the light emitted by Saint Jean Hui to the appearance of the light emitted by Luo Fan, several days had already passed for all living beings in the world. All the Saint Realm saints witnessed the changes in time. However, no one took it to heart. Although they could not completely grasp the specific pattern of this change, they all knew that this change in the flow of time was related to the destruction of this strange state. The greater the damage, the greater the difference in the time dimension between it and the normal world. This was not a difficult thing for saints. If they wanted to, any one of them could easily reverse it. However, what was the point of this? For saints, time was already something that could be manipulated and used at will. What good would it do for them to maintain the flow of time in the outside world and the flow of time in the world they were in? Therefore, in this situation, they could openly appear to love you. Luo Fan's extremely pure light of destruction could destroy everything, including the endless world. As a result, there was only pure nothingness around it, and no world could be formed, no matter what direction or angle one looked at it from. This ray of light was just pure light. Before the ray of light came into contact with the ray of light emitted by Saint Jean Hui, it had already completely destroyed the boundless world. Those countless worlds collapsed in an instant, transforming into countless tiny fragments of the world. They were like countless blades surrounding the ray of light emitted by Luo Fan. The terrifying and majestic energy it released was constantly attacking the ray of light. However, the final result was that the destruction in the light was destroyed once again. The world fragments were destroyed more and more thoroughly, and finally disappeared completely. They had completely turned into absolute nothingness. The two beams of light collided silently. In an instant, the surrounding saints focused their eyes at the same time. Then, they each raised their hands and brushed at the place where the two lights collided. Dozens of forces condensed into one, directly turning into a powerful defensive layer, directly wrapping the two lights within it. The defensive layer that these dozen saints each carried was very strong. It was almost impossible to find. It was an invisible barrier that represented an unbreakable characteristic. It blocked around the two lights. No matter how terrifying the shockwave that was produced when the two lights collided, as well as the information of destruction that was enough to completely turn the entire world into a calamity sea. It was firmly blocked within it. Although the invisible barrier represented an unbreakable characteristic, the two lights also represented an extreme destruction. When the shock wave that erupted from their collision came into contact with the barrier, it produced an earth-shattering effect. In the entire world, countless major kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, minor kiliocosms, and all living beings within them, everything shook violently in an instant. Vaguely, crackling sounds came from the great Tao of the world, spreading to the eardrums of all living beings, making them feel as if a great disaster was about to befall them. Just the impact of the shock wave and the barrier had already reached such a terrifying level. If the shock wave just now had swept through the entire world without any obstruction, it was easy to imagine what the consequences would be. Perhaps the entire world would be instantly turned into dust. Even the great Tao would collapse in an instant. The destructive light released by Luo Fan and the light released by Saint Jean Hui seemed to have collided violently. However, in reality, the mysterious changes and subtle shockwaves contained within the two lights were so complicated that they could explode the heads of all supreme venerables. However, because the transformations of the two were of the same level of mysteriousness and the same level of profoundness, the clash between the two made it seem so crude and lacking in skill. In fact, this was also the characteristic of almost all truly high-level and high-level battles. This was because after reaching that extremely high level, all the changes in techniques had already reached the limit. All the peculiarities displayed in the battle would naturally counteract each other, thus returning the battle to the difference in the essence of strength. Thus, compared to the lower-level battles where one could easily change their techniques hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times, it was much more crude. When everything calmed down, the outcome of the battle was already revealed. In the end, Saint Jean Hui's expression remained the same. He looked as calm as before, and even his clothes were not wrinkled from the collision earlier. Just by looking at his appearance, no one would be able to guess that he had once fought a battle that nearly destroyed countless worlds in this world. In comparison, Luo Fan, who was not far away from him, did not seem much different from before, but his aura was slightly unstable. Based on their appearances, it was obvious who was stronger and who was weaker. Obviously, it was Luo Fan who had suffered a slight loss. After all, he was not a true saint, and this pure light of annihilation was not something he had comprehended himself. Instead, it was something he had grasped from his own memories. Compared to the divine ability that Saint Jean Hui had condensed through his own efforts, its power was naturally weaker. Seeing the difference between them, Luo Fan sighed and said, "Saint Jean Hui is indeed a senior saint. I can't compare to him in terms of power. What's the point of lying when we're at our level? Although I'm slightly stronger than you, you're still hiding your strength. I'm not the only one who can see that, the other fellow Taoists can too," Saint Jean Hui said without holding back. Chapter 1483. Of course, Luo Fan did not reveal all his trump cards just now. Watermark advertisement test at the very least. He did not use the true sage god power that he had mastered. If he had really used this god power, the outcome of the battle just now was still unknown. Of course, although he thought that he still had trump cards that he had not used, he did not think that he could beat Sage Jean Hui so arbitrarily. After all, he did not use the true sage god power, yet Sage Jean Hui had used all his power? That was obviously not the case. At the very least, he had not used his pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure. Judging from the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure that he had seen in the world that the Holy Venerable had created, if he had used it, the power of his god power would have been at least 10 times or even 100 times stronger than before. In that case, even if he used the true sage god power, he might not necessarily win. Of course, it was just to test each other's strength. Just this level of confrontation was already enough. However, there was no need for a complete life and death battle to determine a true winner. Therefore, whether it was Luo Fan or Sage Jean Hui, they did not dwell on this topic at this time. After each of them said that sentence as a summary of the battle, they did not say anything else. After that, a sage that Luo Fan felt had the most unfathomable aura said, "Since you have already proven your strength, we can agree that you can participate in this matter as the 20th sage." Hearing this, Luo Fan's heart shook. He knew that this was a response to his previous question about what benefits he could obtain by participating in their matter. Although the identity of being one of the 20 sages seemed to be just an acknowledgement of his identity, this was already a perfect answer to all of Luo Fan's doubts. Being the 20th sage meant that he would also be able to obtain the same benefits that these sages could obtain. Such a promise could be said to be extremely heavy. I accept this identity. However, if what the sages say is different from what I expect, I won't be polite with you. I won't be courteous with all of you, Luo Fan said indifferently. The sage who gave Luo Fan the title of the 20th sage was the first sage to become a sage in this world. His title was the beginning sage. He was the teacher of almost all the other sages and taught them the various mysteries after they became sages. He taught them how to familiarize themselves with the existence of the sage realm as quickly as possible. Therefore, he was the strongest among these sages, be it in terms of strength or status. He gave Luo Fan his identity. However, none of the saints objected. Moreover, none of the sages objected to his decision. Everyone gave up the position of leader to this primordial sage. The Genesis sage looked like a very ordinary young man. His face was slightly yellow, and his eyes were filled with endless wisdom. He was the kind of person that only sages could exist. His indifference towards all living things as ants was even deeper than that of other saints. This made this indifference even harder to detect, and he seemed even kinder than the other saints. When the Genesis sage heard Luo Fan's words, he smiled faintly. I'm sure you'll be interested. After all, what we plan to do is to become a sage. When he heard this, Luo Fan was stunned. Weren't they already sages? How could they become sages? However, he quickly reacted. The Genesis sage said that he wanted to become a sage, but he did not want to become a fake sage like them. He wanted to become a true sage. A true sage who was not bound by the shackles of heaven and earth and could freely travel between states of chaos. In an instant, he was shocked and said, "You found a way to turn the false into the real?" When they heard this, the expressions of the sages did not change at all. However, Luo Fan faintly felt that the atmosphere around him had inexplicably changed. Obviously, the result of his words was not as calm as it seemed on the surface. However, because the sages had a deep state of mind and would not change much due to external factors, they did not show it. That was why the sages did not see the change in their emotions. Turning the false into the real. This is a very good and accurate phrase. That's right, we have found a way to turn the false into the real, the Genesis sage said. What do you guys plan to do? Luo Fan asked faintly. As fake sages, it was even more difficult for them to become true sages than it was for a level 9 fake sage. However, although it was difficult, they had already become false sages. Their mystical abilities and wisdom had increased tremendously. It was not impossible for them to think of a special method to turn the false into the real one at any time. Therefore, at this time Luo Fan was extremely curious. He was curious about what method they had thought of and how likely it was to succeed. Ever since a certain world suddenly entered the primordial chaos, there have been drastic changes in the universe, the Genesis sage said. From that moment on, the originally independent universe was strung together. Living beings who were originally limited to their own worlds began to discover countless worlds that were at the same level as them. The sages who originally thought that they were the only ones in the universe also began to discover that there were many sages in the universe that were far beyond their imagination. When the Genesis sage said this, it was as if a certain world had suddenly entered the primordial chaos. It was something that happened hundreds of millions of years ago. However, in reality, Luo Fan, who was involved in the whole thing, knew very well that the time that the world had entered the primordial chaos was only a few years ago. In the secular world, such a short period of time would not have been enough for the news of the world entering the primordial chaos to spread to more than 10 worlds. However, for the cultivation world, especially the sages, these few years were enough for them to completely overturn all the concepts they had established in the past and re-establish an unbreakable concept. It was even enough for them to prove it countless times, such as this plan to turn the false into the real. Therefore, at this moment, the Genesis sage felt that the world had entered the primordial chaos. His attitude was that the world had entered the primordial chaos was that it had happened a long time ago. However, Luo Fan was not surprised at all. At this moment, his feelings were extremely complicated. This time, after his incarnation left the world that he had created, all the questions that he had seen and felt were answered. Why had there been so many marks in that void? Why had it been so easy for Taoist Boulder to become a saint? Why did these sages think that the rock Taoist needed it? They did not object to the replenishment of the supreme authority of the world. Instead, they seemed to welcome it. It turned out that the root of the reason was that the world that the sacred venerable had created had passed through the seventh great calamity of the world. As a result, it had left the earth and entered the primordial chaos. This process, to the sacred venerable, it was a process of leaving the earth, which was another person's ocean, and stepping into a small pond that belonged to him. It was a process of taking the first step of gaining true independence. However, this process had a completely different meaning to the living beings in the earth and the sacred venerable's world that could sense the changes in the world. This was because this gave them hope, the hope of transcending. The hope of transcendence was nothing to the supreme venerables and the pseudo-sage existences. At most, they would discover that there was another path that they could not take. However, for those sages who had reached the limits of their respective worlds, it was like having a table of sumptuous dishes placed in front of a burly man who had been starving for a few months. It was so attractive to them that it was simply unparalleled. It was enough to destroy the concepts that they had built up over billions of trillions of years in a very short period of time. It made them start to activate the fighting spirit that they had not activated for who knows how long, to think, to plan, and to fight. After understanding this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. He did not expect the changes caused by the sacred venerable's world passing through the seventh great calamity would be so drastic. It actually directly changed the situation of countless worlds in the earth, and might even cause a war between countless worlds. Although the Saint of Genesis did not tell him what his plan was, Luo Fan could already roughly guess. The method that Xian could think of to turn the false into the real must have something to do with the sages of other worlds. To achieve this, for the sages who could not live apart from the world, of course, the only way was through a war between worlds. How many sages are there in all the worlds? Luo Fan sighed and asked. According to the current interaction between the cultivators of this world and the cultivators of other worlds, there are more than 1,200 worlds with sages in all the worlds, the Saint of Genesis said faintly. More than 1,200. Even though Luo Fan had expected this, he could not help but be shocked. There were more than 1,200 worlds with sages, which meant that there were more than 1,200 worlds at the same level as the demon realm. Although they belonged to the boundless universe, they were worlds that were close to being truly perfect. According to the average number of 10 sages in a world, the number of sages would be the same. Did that not mean that there were more than 12,000 sages? Of course, this number could not be accurate. After all, this average number was only based on the situation of the few worlds with sages that Luo Fan had seen so far. The exact number might be lower than this, or it might be higher than this. However, no matter how low it was, it would definitely not be less than thousands. Thinking of this number, Luo Fan could not help but feel his scalp go numb. If he had not obtained the supreme authority of a world, he would only be a dish in front of the sages. Did this not mean that there were tens of thousands of existences in this world who could casually need him like a dish? Thinking of this, Luo Fan's previous arrogance of having almost reached the peak of the sage realm, almost obtaining his own independent perfect world, was suddenly struck to the point that not even a drop was left. A long-lost feeling of how vast the Earth's universe was and how there were so many mysteries that were worth his time to explore once again emerged in his heart. This feeling made Luo Fan put on a faint smile and said, "I did not expect there to be so many sages in all the worlds. This is really exciting. This is only what we have discovered so far. In fact, almost every few days, there will be cultivators from this world and new sages coming into contact. Cultivators from worlds with sages come into contact. This allows us to discover new worlds with sages, and also to discover the other side's sages. They discovered us, the Genesis saint said calmly. His words did not contain any emotions. However, Luo Fan could clearly sense that his heart was filled with fighting spirit and hope. The kind of fighting spirit that saw a challenge. What do you guys plan to do? Luo Fan asked. Us, the Genesis saint corrected him. It depends on what exactly you want to do. Turning the false into the true. I once saw a saint try to destroy the world, but he failed. It's not a simple thing to do, Luo Fan said faintly. Apart from the rock Taoist, everyone else looked at Luo Fan with a different expression after hearing this. He had seen a sage destroy a world, but he had actually survived. Even if they had already tested Luo Fan's strength before, they still couldn't help but be a little surprised at this time. They were shocked by his strength. However, they could not ask him. They could only be secretly vigilant in their hearts. The reason why sages like us are fake is because we are restricted by the world and cannot transcend. To turn the fake into the real, we need to break this shackle. We need to absorb the power of the world and many sages to break this shackle, the Genesis saint said. So, you guys plan to start a world war, crush and devour other worlds and absorb other sages? Luo Fan frowned. The Genesis saint said calmly, it is not that cruel. We just want to obtain the sage status of those worlds. In my opinion, this does not make much difference. Although I am not a sage, I know that it is almost impossible to become a sage in two worlds using normal method. Unless you can completely shatter the great Tao of the other world and take the opportunity to obtain a sage status within it. How is this different from crushing those worlds and devouring them? Luo Fan said. Yes. The difference is that those worlds can be reborn and not destroyed, the Genesis saint said calmly. Fellow Taoist, you do not seem like such a benevolent person. Each time you fight, you destroy billions of worlds, the rock Taoist said calmly. The number of worlds destroyed in each of your battles is in the billions, the rock saint said in an indifferent voice. Indeed, the number of worlds I destroy in every battle is in the billions. As such, I don't think it's unacceptable for you to crush and devour these worlds, Luo Fan said as he glanced at the monolith saint. Then, what do you mean? The rock saint asked. What you're doing is a disaster for the saints of the world. Not only will they be stripped of their sage positions, they will also be destroyed. Luo Fan said, if that's the case, you won't be able to achieve your true goal. The sages in the world will destroy the world before they are powerless to reverse the situation. Therefore, this method is definitely not a way to turn a fake into a real one. Normally, that would be the case. However, if we are far stronger than them, so much so that they can't even react in time, then this won't be the case, the Genesis saint said calmly. You guys have already lost your rationality. Luo Fan said faintly. Perhaps. However, even if we don't do anything, the other sages will. The final result was the same. From the moment that world broke through and entered the primal chaos, this outcome was already decided. No one, not even a sage, could change this result. You are even more unable to change it. What you can do is reap the most benefits from this process and improve yourself the most, the Saint of Genesis said. Luo Fan was momentarily speechless. He was no fool, so he could immediately tell that the Genesis sage was right. Among the many sages in the 1,200 worlds with sages, there were definitely many sages who had the same thoughts as the primordial sages. It was even possible that most of the sages had the same mentality. Even if the Genesis sage and the others did not make a move, there would still be sages who would come knocking on their doors in the end. This world would still be plunged into a tragic war. In the end, they would fight to the death with some other world. From this aspect, the decision of the Genesis sage and the others was a more proactive one. However, it could maintain the stability of this world to the greatest extent. Why do you need me? Luo Fan sighed and asked. This world needs at least 20 sages to move at the same time. There are only 19 of us, the Genesis sage said. It was difficult to move a world outside of this world. However, the difficulty had not reached an exaggerated level. For example, if one wanted to move this world outside of this world, any false sage would be able to do it easily. However, if one wanted to move this world inside of this world, it would be as difficult as an ordinary person trying to lift themselves up by the hair. Even if they had shocking intelligence, even the nearly omnipotent sages needed to gather the power of many sages to break through the shackles of this nature and achieve this. According to the calculations of the Genesis sage, it was obvious that it would take the power of at least 20 sages to move this world. 20 sages. Luo Fan sighed. It seems that before I arrived, this world should have been in an absolute defensive position and could only wait for the sages of other worlds to attack. His words did not receive any reply. At this moment, the 19 sages in front of Luo Fan were all looking at him quietly, waiting for his decision. All right. What should I do? Luo Fan sighed and said. Although the sages had already treated him as their equal and seemed to be asking for his consent, Luo Fan knew that if he did not agree, the sages in front of him would definitely not let him off easily. Even the bolder saint would most likely attack him at the first possible moment. Even if Luo Fan had the highest authority in this world, he would not be able to escape from the destructive attacks of 19 sages. If that happened, he would probably lose this incarnation of his once again. Therefore, if Luo Fan wanted to keep this clone, there was only one choice he could make, and that was to agree to it. Apart from having no choice but to agree to the 19 false sages, Luo Fan was actually also curious about the battle between the sages. He wanted to witness such a scene. In any case, regardless of whether he agreed or not, whether he participated or not, this terrifying war between worlds was bound to happen. Since that was the case, what reason did he have not to participate in it and witness the terrifying battle between tens of thousands of sages, with worlds as units? Hearing Luo Fan agree, everyone's expression did not change. Only the Genesis sage smiled and said, "This world has 20 fulcrums, and these fulcrums support the entire world. To move this world, we need to activate these fulcrums at the same time and make them move in the same direction at the same time. Only then can we achieve the goal of moving this world." As he spoke, waves of information flowed into Luo Fan's heart. This information was about the locations of the 20 fulcrums, their characteristics, as well as the method to activate them, and so on. It was almost the most fundamental secret of this world. This was a technique of a sage. It was not a real remarkable ability but just a small technique. However, it was already magical enough. As Luo Fan looked through the information, he gradually understood what the Genesis sage and the others wanted him to do. He could not help but sigh and say, "I'm afraid this isn't simple. The power of a sage that I have now is bestowed by this world. It doesn't seem reliable to shake the fulcrums of this world with such power." Chapter 1484. The fulcrum that Luo Fan was in charge of was a void in the starry sky. Watermark advertisement test. Watermark advertisement test. This was the deepest part of the starry sky, and there was not a single star within a range of billions of miles. Even the starlight found it difficult to reach here, causing this place to be covered in darkness. Many cultivators in this world were unable to cast their gazes over here. For sages, it was naturally impossible for them to procrastinate. Since it had been decided, of course, they would immediately take action. After distributing the 20 fulcrum to the 20 of them, everyone began to move, either into the sky or into the ground, or into the sea, or directly at the border of this world. In the blink of an eye, they had already scattered to various places in this world. Luo Fan had also arrived at the fulcrum that he was in charge of. Using the supreme authority that he had obtained in this world to observe this place, he very quickly discovered the specialness of this place. Here, it looked ordinary, but the nomological laws contained all the nomological laws in this world, forming a node of billions of nomological laws. Vaguely, the great Tao that this position was connected to was a certain key of that great Tao, and it was related to the entire great Tao. As long as it was slightly touched, it would have an extremely huge impact on the great Tao. This was the fulcrum. Luo Fan had the supreme authority, but the ones in charge of the other fulcrum were sages. He could rely on this supreme authority to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient, but the sages in the other positions could also rely on their own strength to be omnipotent. When he arrived here, the sages in the other positions were also in position at the same time. Looking at this fulcrum, Luo Fan instinctively knew how to shake this fulcrum, how to move this fulcrum. There was no need for the other sages to teach him the method. He raised his hand, and a spiritual light appeared in his hand. This spiritual light was extremely mysterious, condensed, and pure. It was as if it was real. As soon as it appeared, it also emitted a sense of eternity and indestructibility. The aura that belonged to a sage. This aura, because of Luo Fan's restriction, did not really spread out. It only enveloped the depths of the starry sky within a radius of billions of miles. After the spiritual light appeared, with a wave of his hand, the spiritual light abruptly invaded the void and completely connected with the fulcrum. The moment the connection was established, Luo Fan had a strange feeling. He seemed to have grasped the pulse of heaven and earth. As long as he willed it, a large portion of this world would collapse. Destruction. Even the laws of heaven and earth would become incomparably chaotic. As expected of the fulcrum, a saint is indeed a saint. Even if he's a false sage, his understanding of the essence of the world is not something that ordinary cultivators can compare with. Upon discovering this, Luo Fan could not help but feel emotional. This was the first time he had noticed this kind of fulcrum that existed in the world. This was also the first time he felt the importance of this fulcrum. In the past, he could look down on the great thousand worlds and even destroy countless great thousand worlds with a single move. However, he had never experienced the subtle details of these worlds so deeply. He did not know that there was such an important fulcrum in the world. This fulcrum was a certain key point that supported the entire world. Being connected to it, apart from the feeling of being able to control the life and death of a large portion of the world at any time, there was also the terrifying pressure that came from supporting the world. This pressure did not affect his body, but his mind, making him feel as if he was carrying an incomparably vast world. That feeling was really complicated and indescribable. At this moment, an inexplicable feeling came. In a trance, Luo Fan saw that the entire world, the endless world, had suddenly become illusory. Only during this time, the 20 points that were distributed throughout the entire world became more and more real, and more obvious in an instant. He knew that these were the 20 fulcrum of this world. Now that the world had become illusory and the 20 fulcrum had become real, it was clear that the other fulcrum were also in place and could be operated. Fellow Taoists, we need to condense this world first before we can move. Otherwise, this world will probably shake apart many small worlds during the process of moving. Before we reach our destination, we will be damaged first. The voice of the Genesis sage was heard by everyone. Regarding this, everyone had already expected it. Even Luo Fan already knew that there must be such a process first, so no one raised any objections. This world was about to move to another world to fight against another world. Even if it couldn't shatter the small world in the process of moving, it had to be condensed again to make this world more stable and powerful. Only then would it be easier for them to win the war. Otherwise, if this world maintained its original natural appearance, it would be as if it was going to fight with others without any defense. That would definitely be an act of suicide. In an instant, a message appeared from nothingness and was received by all the sages and Luo Fan. It was a method of condensing this world with the help of these 20 fulcrum. This method was extremely mysterious and contained the endless and profound Tao of the sages. Even Luo Fan could only understand this method and know how to use it by relying on the supreme authority granted by this world. If he didn't have this kind of supreme authority, even if this method was placed in front of Luo Fan, he would certainly be confused. He wouldn't know what was written on it, whether there were any traps hidden in it, whether there were any schemes. It might even take an unknown number of years of research before he could understand how to use it. However, this was naturally not the case now. With a thought, the various mysteries of this method flowed through Luo Fan's mind, allowing him to instantly understand everything. What an exquisite method! If I condense it like this, the appearance of this world will become a huge flying sword. At that time, the world itself will be an extremely powerful magic treasure. If I were to face a world that has not been condensed before, I would definitely be able to defeat it in one move. Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim in admiration again. The more he interacted with the saints, the more he felt how profound their wisdom was. In terms of offensive power and defensive power, as long as one obtained the supreme authority of this world, even an ordinary cultivator would not be able to defeat them. He could barely guarantee that he had the ability to escape from a sage. For someone like Luo Fan, who had already understood the essence of cultivation and had experienced many holy wars, it was impossible for him to be a genius. With such a high level of authority, he could even be on par with sages in these aspects. However, apart from these kinds of fighting methods, the gap between ordinary cultivators and sages was so huge that it made people feel hopeless. For example, although cultivators with supreme authority had the potential to create all kinds of magical abilities and techniques with different effects, they had the ability to do so. However, only the sages were able to create the truly marvelous divine abilities and techniques. Only a sage could have this kind of wisdom and perfectly display this kind of potential, creating countless great divine abilities that ordinary cultivators couldn't even imagine. It was precisely because of this fact. Even though he felt that he could be on par with those sages, the methods that those sages used still amazed Luo Fan and made him feel that his horizons had been broadened. He felt admiration. The method to condense the entire world was extremely complicated and exquisite. Even with the help of the fulcrum of this world, it would still require an endless amount of energy to achieve. It also required the use of the Tao of the Sage on a large scale and the execution of trillions of false sage divine abilities to be completed. Such a requirement meant that this method could only be carried out by sages, other than Luo Fan, who wasn't a sage. The ones who controlled the other fulcrum were all sages. There was naturally no obstacle to their understanding of the Tao of the Sage. Since Luo Fan could understand that method so quickly, they naturally wouldn't have any problems. Very soon, everyone's thoughts flowed, and in the blink of an eye, they had already decided what they should do and what their respective missions were. Luo Fan was in charge of 1/20th of them, over 30 trillion false sage divine abilities. Each of these false sage divine abilities was extremely mysterious and complicated. However, each of them involved a certain aspect of the profundity of the Tao of the Sage. Although over 30 trillion divine abilities couldn't completely include the infinite Tao of the Sage. However, it also included almost everything that Luo Fan could think of, as well as many aspects of the Tao of the Sage. It could be said that mastering over 30 trillion false sage divine abilities would increase Luo Fan's strength, at least after obtaining the supreme authority, would be earth-shattering. Before this, the false sage divine abilities that Luo Fan had mastered were only those that he had encountered in the battle with the Monolith Saint's predecessor, Saint Yuan Bai, and the World Annihilation Saint. There were only a few of them. This restriction made it so that although Luo Fan had the power of the false sage divine ability, his own methods were rather simple, and his use of the power of the false sage divine ability was rather crude, Although this situation didn't affect Luo Fan's combat strength much, it made him seem to be lacking in methods when facing many situations, and he could only rely on some rough methods to solve them. As long as he could obtain over 30 trillion false sage divine abilities, this disadvantage would instantly disappear. Over 30 trillion was an extremely shocking number. With so many divine abilities, it was enough to cover all aspects. It could be said that there were millions of ways to deal with every situation. It could be said that Luo Fan's weakness of lacking saint-level methods had been instantly converted into an advantage of having plenty of methods. With so many false sage divine abilities, Luo Fan's strength would be greatly increased after he obtained the supreme authority of a certain world. Even if he lost this supreme authority, he would still be able to obtain endless benefit. Although after he lost this supreme authority, these false sage divine abilities would become profound existences that he couldn't comprehend or understand, and it would be even more impossible for him to use them. However, as long as he could comprehend any of the profundities contained in these pseudo-saint omniscient powers, it would be enough to bring him great benefits. It would be enough for his cultivation realm to be greatly improved, even. It would be enough for him to use his own methods to simulate these divine abilities, just like how the monolith saint simulated his own saint divine abilities back then, to achieve the effect of obtaining the power of these divine abilities. With the experience of controlling these false sage divine abilities, he used various other methods to simulate them. The power of these divine abilities, even if they couldn't compare to the real false sage divine abilities, they were definitely 100 times better than normal situations. The effect was also 100 or 1,000 times stronger than simulating them out of thin air. Moreover, more importantly, these false sage divine abilities contained the wisdom of the false sage. This was the most important thing. The inspiration and wisdom that could perfectly unleash the power of a saint-level divine ability could be like guiding lights, guiding Luo Fan to control the abilities that he couldn't control as much as possible, knowing the benefits that these 30 trillion false sage divine abilities would bring to him. Luo Fan suddenly felt extremely glad that he had agreed to help this world participate in the terrifying war that was about to start. Just these 30 trillion false sage divine abilities alone were enough to make up for the value of his incarnation. Although he sighed inwardly, Luo Fan didn't stop at all. With the help of the supreme authority given by this world, he slapped the 30 trillion false sage divine abilities towards this fulcrum. Then, through this fulcrum, they spread out to the boundless world, gradually causing the world and the boundless world to undergo some kind of extremely subtle change. At the same time, at the positions of the other 19 fulcrum, false sage divine abilities were also continuously slapped towards the fulcrum and then spread to the entire world. It was unknown how many major kiliacosms, medium kiliacosms, and minor kiliacosms were combined, gradually causing these worlds to change, and then the entire world to gradually change. Over 30 trillion false sage divine abilities. Even if each one only took an instant, the total time needed would definitely be long enough to make one feel despair. If they really carried out this kind of work according to the normal flow of time, then by the time they truly condensed this world might have already been destroyed by other worlds. Therefore, at this moment, the saints and Luo Fan all accelerated the flow of time in their bodies. They accelerated to a terrifying time flow that would make ordinary cultivators' hair stand on end. He slapped one divine ability after another onto the fulcrum, and they spread out into the world, constantly changing and condensing the world due to the terrifying flow of time. The evolution of the world, which should have taken tens of thousands of years to complete, was compressed into just a few days. Looking from the outside, the world that had given birth to a total of 19 saints gradually began to condense from its originally loose appearance. The countless major kiliacosms, medium kiliacosms, and minor kiliacosms that were originally like smoke began to gradually compress and condense. In the end, they completely attached to the surface of the world, as if there was an incomparably tough layer of defense covering the surface of the world. Countless dense layers of light exuded an aura of eternal indestructibility and indestructibility as they shrouded the defensive layer, causing the defensive layer's strength to increase almost endlessly. Faintly, it seemed to have risen to the level of a pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure. At the same time, the appearance of the world gradually changed. From its original appearance, it compressed into the appearance of a hiltless flying sword. The surface of the hiltless flying sword was covered by the defensive layer formed by the world and the divine abilities of the saints. From the outside, it no longer looked like a great world that could give birth to a saint. Instead, it had become a mysterious treasure that was condensed from a world. Just when the last layer of eternal and indestructible light covered the surface of the defensive layer of the world, the entire world slightly trembled. An indescribable spirituality was naturally born from the flying sword. This spirituality allowed the flying sword to fly freely in the void. In a flash, it even released a large expanse of sword light. In the void, it displayed an indescribably exquisite sword technique. It gave birth to countless worlds of sword light that spread out and enveloped the tens of millions of great kiliocosms. It made the living beings in those worlds feel the terror of the end of the world. Fortunately, the sword light did not erupt unconsciously. Although it had already enveloped the tens of millions of great kiliocosms, in the end, it did not erupt with its true power and completely destroy the great kiliocosms. Instead, after existing for a moment, it slightly swayed and disappeared without a trace. It was as if it had never appeared. In the void, only the unbelievably large formation appeared in the void and began to move towards a certain direction in the void. In this world, at this moment, the fulcrum of the 20 worlds had completely changed their positions. The fulcrum that Luo Fan controlled had already reached the middle of the front of the long sword. In front of him, in other words, he was thinking about the direction of the tip of the flying sword. There was a fulcrum that was controlled by 3 saints in front. Behind him, there was a fulcrum that was controlled by 16 saints. Of course, these 20 points could not be arranged in a straight line. They were arranged in an extremely complicated and mysterious way to form a whole. In other words, a mysterious formation had become the true bearing point of the flying sword. If the flying sword were to be destroyed, it would first have to destroy them. Among these 20 fulcrum, the fulcrum that was closest to the tip of the sword was the fulcrum that Saint Jean Hui controlled. That fulcrum itself was attached to. It was not the sky but the highest and largest in this world, the strongest mountain peak. This mountain peak itself seemed to have extended from the ground and pierced into the sky, as if it was a sharp sword that wanted to cut the sky open. Its status was similar to that of the Buzhou mountain in the primordial world. It was almost regarded as the key to supporting the world, although this world had undergone such an astonishing change in form in just a few days. However, for all living beings in this world, even for those pseudo-sage existences, they could only occasionally sense that this world seemed to be undergoing some special changes, but they could not really see what the changes were. They did not know that in just a few days, the world they were in had turned into a huge flying sword. Everything in the world looked the same as before. The earth was still the same, and the starry sky in the sky was still the same. Even the countless major kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, and minor kiliocosms hidden in the world were still in their original positions. They could still be found and entered in the same way. However, apart from the fact that there was no change, there were also many things that had changed in this world. For example, due to the condensation and change of the world, the strange gravity and climate in this world had become increasingly strange. The astonishing changes in the environment in the mountain range where the monolith saint used to be had now become extremely common. It had almost become the norm in this world. This drastic change caused almost 20% of the living beings in this world to perish because they couldn't adapt to the sudden change of environment. This was because the living beings in this world were extremely adaptable due to the special nature of the world itself. Otherwise, at least 50% or even 60% of the living beings in this world would die a violent death due to the drastic change of environment. If it was more serious, it would not be an exaggeration to increase this number to 80% or 90%. Such a drastic change almost made the premonition of the end of the world, which had been slightly suppressed, become even more intense for all living beings. The entire world, which had calmed down a little, once again fell into chaos at this moment. Countless living beings who did not die in the drastic change in environment died in the slaughter of other living beings. The sages were also indifferent to such changes. They did not look at this world, and none of them made a move to change this fact. At this moment, all of them were doing their best to activate that fulcrum, allowing this part of the world to rapidly approach their target. Even though it had changed its form, the difficulty of activating the heaven and earth was not much lower than before. It still required 20 sages to work together to unleash the power of their abilities. Their target was a world with only 10 sages, or rather 10 pseudo-sages.